Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at the Aeldari rankings via tier list and how they've changed in Pariah Nexus. So as you guys know, every major change, I always do a new and updated tier list for you guys to give you guys a general idea of how good each unit is. Now, having said that, just because something is maybe B or even C tier on the list does not mean it is not usable. In certain builds, it could be quite good. It just requires a little bit of thinking. Something in S tier, for example, would be something that's auto-include in most competitive lists. A tier are very good units that are in, again, a lot of competitive lists. B tier and C tier are units that you may seldom see in competitive lists here and there when they fit in, and the role that they provide gives a benefit to that list overall. And the units in D tier are going to be those who are not good in any type of list unless you are playing narratively, casually, or perhaps even you have a certain idea with that unit and you're basically, pouring a lot of points into making it good, which I also don't think is very good in general for competitive play. However, these are all also my opinions. So if you guys have any additional comments you would like to make in the comments section about the where the units belong, definitely do that. I love hearing your guys' feedback, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think is where. Okay, so starting out, we have the old ass man, of course, and Asurmen is quite cost effective now. And he was 115 points in the beginning of the edition, and in my honest opinion, he was quite good at that cost. I do like him at 115, and that's just because he has a pretty good ranged weapon, his combat ability's good, he buffs Dire Avengers in a significant way, giving them basically a free Overwatch, and, his Overwatch himself is not bad, especially when on an objective. Dire Avengers themselves, though, are probably the weak link in this just because they're not that great of a unit, but they are more cost effective than their contemporaries now after the nerfs, so that is one thing. And overall, I think Asurmen is pretty good, but I don't think he's quite the best. And because of that, I'm probably not going to put him in S tier. In my opinion, he's more of an A tier Phoenix Lord. He's good. He has a great ability to, again, kill things like Terminators in close combat. He can definitely shoot up Marines at range. And Dire Avengers, obviously Overwatch, can do some good damage against infantry and may do a couple of wounds against a vehicle here and there. Nothing to write home about with the Dire Avengers, but they're a solid enough unit and they're cheap enough now that maybe a small unit of them could be warranted if you definitely want to take Asurmen with you in the game. Also, putting them in a Falcon, although I don't think it's the best way to use a Falcon, might be an option as well. So Asurmen, I'm actually going to put in A tier. I actually think that his invul save and his great damage profile in both, combat and a good range profile at range makes him a decent candidate for a Falcon and perhaps even a, squad of 5 Dire Avengers if you need them. I also think he's great with this unit of 10 Dire Avengers if you want to go all in on that type of unit. And in some matchups, that's going to be really great. Asurmen with 10 Dire Avengers into something like Greentide is extremely good. It's also really good into things like Genestealer Cult. So if you guys don't know, Genestealer Cult, they've just gotten a new codex. I don't know how good it is, and again, I think Genestealer Cult is one of those armies that really just confuddles me because no one in my group plays them. I've never actually seen a Genestealer Cult player ever in my local area, so I didn't even know they existed for for a while. But obviously, I don't really know exactly on the actual battlefield how good a unit of Dire Avengers against Genestealer Cult is, but I'm telling you now, having seen them on paper and having seen them being played at tournaments and things like that, I think 10 Dire Avengers with Asurmen, if it can get on an objective early, is a very good counter to that. And they're, in general, just really good against light infantry. So I definitely would say they're A tier, but not an auto-include in every list, or definitely not a consideration in every single list. Okay, next is Maugan Ra. Maugan Ra is probably one of the worst Phoenix Lords in my opinion. He did get a points decrease, but I think he needed more. I'm not sure why GW is pricing him at 115. He has mediocre melee capabilities, and honestly, his range capabilities are outshined by the Death Jester. So There you go. He doesn't really do anything for Dark Reapers either. I think as a narrative pick or a casual pick, he's awesome. And he can do a lot if you put the points into him. You really need to, again, you need to basically feed him different units to buff, right? You need to feed him things like lethal hits. You need to feed him things like, I mean, lethal hits is kind of even counterproductive because he has devastating wounds. So you definitely need to kind of like run him in a way that basically pours a lot of points into him, and I don't really like him because of that. He's not really self-sufficient. His ability also isn't that great. I think being able to reroll, hits and wounds against units under half strength, it's okay, but it doesn't apply to his unit. If it applied to his unit, I would love this guy. I would think he was great. In fact, I would even run him out of a Falcon with some Dark Reapers. But he just doesn't do that. He's only in it for himself, which is kind of weird for a Phoenix Lord who basically saved the Altnassar craft world from destruction. I know it was his own craft world, but still, he went out of his way to save his people. And I think, having an ability that's so selfish is kind of, it's not lore friendly, and I don't like it. So I'm going to put him in D tier. And well, maybe I'll put him in C tier. I think C tier is a little more fair. Just because, I mean, he does do damage, right? I mean, he's not worthless. He's not like a Hemlock Wraithfighter or, like a Webway Gate or something. So, he's just not in a great place at the moment. He's really a unit that you really need to pour a lot of resources into him, and he doesn't give back. Okay, next up is Karandras. Karandras is excellent, and I think he's even better now because of the points decrease. He was good before, but now at 90 points, he's absolutely premium, and you're seeing him pop up in a lot of lists with Striking Scorpions because they also got a points decrease basically last data slate. Not this one, but the last points changes. So Karandras is, I'm not going to waste your guys' time. He's S tier for sure. He's amazing. He's a great Phoenix Lord. He's great out of a Falcon. I wouldn't recommend infiltrating with him with a unit of Striking Scorpions just because it makes the Scorpions too expensive, makes them too much of a target, and they'll probably die very quickly, Karandras included. He is tough, but he's not that tough, and when you put him in a unit like that, it makes him a big target. There's a lot of units in the game that can easily wipe something like that out. So I definitely think he's one of those guys. You put in a Falcon with some Striking Scorpions, you maximize your rerolls on devastating wounds, and he's just awesome in general. If his unit survives a turn as well and you have a Farseer Skyrunner in your army, oh my god. It's great because of course you can guide them, and Striking Scorpions have sustained hits. He has sustained hits on a 4+ when he charges. So that's really powerful. I mean, if your opponent leaves them alive after they do their initial strike, then you're in a good position to wipe out a whole nother unit if you need to. I don't know the exact math on it, but Karandras and 5 Scorpions can easily wipe out 5 Terminators just because of the fact that they deal devastating wounds out of a Falcon, right? So they can wipe up a large chunk of your opponent's army if given the chance for a relatively low cost. 65 plus 90. They're only 155 points, guys. That's insane. I mean, think about like how many points, enemy Space Marine players spend on aggressors, and they spend on, all the things that, like Sword Brethren, for example, from Black Templar, or, Blade Guard veterans, for example. They're really expensive units, and the fact that Karandras and 5 Scorpions can just roll up there, cigars sticking out, and just bling them to death with devastating wounds is just amazing. So, really good Phoenix Lord, and honestly, undisputedly S tier now. And I would definitely try him out in a couple of games. He's seen a lot of tournament play even before the buffs, and I think now, because of the kind of meta that we're in right now in Pariah Nexus, he's even better. Okay, Fuegan is next. And again, not going to waste your time with this. He's S tier. We all know why. He's extremely tough. 5+ feel no pain. He has a revive ability on top of that. He can one-shot tanks with Fate Dice. And honestly, sometimes he can one-shot tanks just by rolling normally. Because, I mean, there are times when you will roll that 5 or 6 or even a 4, boosting the damage to 10, 11, or 12, and you'll be able to kill most tanks with that. He's extremely effective. He also has pretty good Overwatch against infantry, because he has sustained D3 on his other profile. So he's very versatile. He's good in combat because he can kill Terminators with damage 3, strength 5, AP minus 4. And, he might not kill the whole squad, obviously, but I've had this guy roll up into a unit of, aggressors and stuff like that, and he's wounding on 5s against those. And with a reroll out of a Falcon, I've actually had him kill every single one of them in the unit. All 3 of them, right? Well, in that particular game, there was 3, and he killed all 3 of them, which is pretty good. So he can do some good damage in combat, for sure. Now, if you attach him with Fire Dragons, I think he does buff the Fire Dragon squad, and you might have a good argument in that he's better with the Fire Dragons attached. And I used to think that too in the beginning of the edition, because I was going up against a lot of people who were running, heavy tanks with popping smoke and all that, and the +1 to hit really did help in those situations. I think now, though, as we're going a little bit into more of a marine meta where we're having a lot of tough units like Space Marines and stuff like that, those units aren't popping smoke, and Fuegan happens to be better into those units just solo, right? Not having to waste the Fire Dragon squad. I've actually liked the versatility of being able to choose what comes out of the Falcon when, so I can kind of space out my tools accordingly. If I need them both, they can still both contribute, and usually it's still enough, even if my opponent says, oh, I pop smoke. Typically speaking, the way I run my lists, I have something to ignore cover anyway, and the -1 to hit isn't going to be able to prevent 5 Fire Dragons, Fuegan, and a Falcon from being able to kill my target. So, typically speaking, that's how I run him, but he's perfectly viable joining the Fire Dragons as well. Okay, so that's Fuegan. Let's look at Baharroth. Baharroth is A tier. Now, the reason I put him in A tier is because he's actually pretty good. He's a little bit expensive, though, which I don't like. He's really only good in one unit, and that's a big unit of Swooping Hawks, right? He's not a good solo character because he doesn't have a lone op ability or anything like that to really help him out. And by the way, he also doesn't have Skyleap. So, he can't actually leave the board without a unit of Swooping Hawks. You do need a unit of Swooping Hawks to maximize that effect. He is good with them. It's not like last edition where he was just a solo killer and he could just do basically everything you needed him to do. So, unfortunately, this edition he does need to be Swooping Hawks, but when he is with Swooping Hawks, he's amazing. A unit 10 Swooping Hawks with this guy hit on a 2+, and they're going to be able to, with Guide, reroll hits, and just try to force a bunch of lethals on your opponent. That's going to be excellent in almost any situation. So he's a really good all-comer. He does good damage against pretty much anything in the game because of that lethal hit reroll spam that he can do, and Swooping Hawks, of course, did go up in cost, but it's still a good unit. So I put him in A tier, but only if he's run in that particular way. If he's run any other way, I would think he was a B tier or maybe even a C tier. But because he's able to kind of combo so well in that type of unit to great effect, I think that has to earn himself a place in A tier. Personally, though, I think he should have gotten a points decrease himself because without the Swooping Hawks, he's not really anything good. So I would say he probably should have gotten reduced to 115 from 125, but that's just me. At least to, kind of offset the cost of Hawks. Okay. And as for his ranged weapon and melee weapon, again, not great. They're good, don't get me wrong, but they're not anything spectacular. They're not to the level of Asurmen, Karandras, Fuegan, or even Jain, who we're going to talk about next. So, excuse me, Jain, one of the better Phoenix Lords now for defense. Again, she is to me an A tier Phoenix Lord at this moment. She got a points decrease, which is awesome. She's now 90 points. She's not as aggressive as Karandras. Karandras is more of an offensive kind of character. He wants to be charging into things and just wrecking them on charge. Although he can also do the same thing with Heroic Intervention, just keep that in mind. Jain, on the other hand, is more of a defensive model, and with her Howling Banshees, she's especially defensive because she wants to use her free Heroic Intervention to be able to stop opponents from, being able to get into melee with your units and kill them. Reason why is because she has Fights First. So Fights First and free Heroic Intervention, to me, signify that a unit is going to be a defensive melee unit. She's awesome for this. I think they're just cheap enough now as a package to where you could put them in a Falcon, and if you see the board developing in such a way that your opponent's going to threaten you with a lot of melee units, you can easily just dump them out of the Falcon early and have them play on the defensive. That will give your opponent a lot of cause to pause and maybe not even charge them at all or anything in the surrounding area, at least within 6 inches. So that is something to think about, which is pretty cool. Now, the other thing is she has a pretty good melee profile. It's not the best. It's not as good as Karandras, for example. It's probably on par with Fuegan a little bit, but I would even say it's not as good. But it's still pretty solid. It's really good into Space Marines, and, you know, I think her other abilities more than make up for it. So she's a really good character. I really like her, and at her new cost, I think she's definitely earned her place in A tier. I think you'll see her in some competitive lists going forward. Okay, so the last Phoenix Lord, of course, is Irillyth, which is the Shadow Spectre Phoenix Lord, and he's C tier. He's basically a little bit worse than Maugan Ra. I would even say he's probably more of a D tier Phoenix Lord. Really doesn't do anything for his unit except give them +1. Of course, Shadow Specters, you know, with +1 to hit is pretty good, but, you know, it's not worth the points to basically spend on him. He has a weird weapon also with damage 4, and I think it has 3 shots as well at strength 8. It's just kind of awkward. It's like damage 4, you know, it's kind of good against some stuff, but the amount of things in the game that are 4 wounds that he's good against is very low. So yeah, if your opponent is spamming a bunch of those types of units, he can definitely be good. But how many opponents are actually going to be doing that, right? Probably very little. He also weirdly wants to shoot at different things than his Shadow Specters want to do because he has a different profile. So overall, I just think he's just okay and probably on the side of bad because he's not able to really synergize well with his aspect in the same way Maugan Ra is. And if you notice the other Phoenix Lords, they're able to synergize with their aspects very well, right? Even if you do run them solo, they can synergize pretty well with their aspects. And, you know, Irillyth really just can't do that. So, unfortunately, Irillyth is going to be in C tier. And, of course, the ability is awful. You know, -1 to battle shock tests within 6 is almost never going to be used. Okay, so next up we have the Autarchs. Now, the first one is just the normal Autarch. I want to just put this in B tier right away, and let me give you the explanation as to why. Some people might be wondering about that because he is cheaper. He is a good way to farm CP if you want to, you know, be on a budget. But with the new Pariah mission rules and stuff, you definitely want to have you definitely want to be able to play into the secret missions if you have to. And he just doesn't, right? He's not a lone operative. He's not incredibly tough. He's not incredibly fast. He's not going to be able to get to the enemy objective in a, you know, matter of time, you know, unless you're already just destroying the enemy in the game, in which case you probably don't need to play a secret mission. You could put him in certain units like Storm Guardians, Guardian Defenders, and things like that. I actually think he's better in a Guardian Defender unit just to kind of play on the defensive and farm CP. If you are using him as a budget option, which is perfectly viable, a lot of people don't want to pay the 115 to 150 points for a Autarch Wayleaper. Totally cool. I think he's worth it, but a lot of people out there are like, nah, no way. I'm going to save the points. I'll buy another unit in my army, and I'll have more stuff to work with. That's totally legitimate. However, I don't really think he's good when used aggressively because it makes him a big target. Let's say, for example, he joins a unit of Storm Guardians, and you're advancing up the field trying to make objectives sticky. He's not going to survive long. Right? Your opponent will see that and they'll say, oh, that's the guy that generates extra CP for you. And they'll pour everything into it and they'll die. And you'll lose basically the Autarch for no reason. So unfortunately, I do think he's a B tier. And of course, now his ability, it doesn't even work. Now, they might change that. GW might change that in the future. And if they do change that, I still think he's going to be a B tier, right? Even if he reduces command point cost for stratagems that his unit uses, which would be awesome. That would be so good. And I think he would be definitely worth the pick. I still think, honestly, he would be still a B tier. I don't think he really compares with the Autarch Wayleaper, to be honest. I think the Wayleaper is just not only better in every way, but better in the terms of Pariah Nexus, the secret missions, and stuff like that as well. So, yeah, I just don't think he's that good. But that's just my personal opinion. The Autarch Skyrunner, I think, is basically in the same tier. Now, you guys might be wondering why he's not in C or D tier, and it's just because they've never fixed the basically typo, I think, and it still works like this, that he can farm CP from reserve. I don't know whether that's intentional or not, but he can. His advance 6 inches is decent, especially with the nerf to Fate dice. It's nothing spectacular, and I don't think you want to put him with Wind Riders anyway, but it's not bad. Now, the main draw for this guy is he farms CP for free while in reserve. He's not that expensive either. So you can have him safe in reserve for 3 turns of free CP with no worries. And I think that might appeal to some people. Later in the game, if you want to kind of bring him out and kind of flank an enemy, maybe they're not expecting it. He's a small model. If you guys don't know this, the Autarch is an older model, so he's on a very small flying base. So he can very easily come in the corner of a battlefield on turn 3 and just be a nuisance, score on objectives, things like that. And I think that makes him pretty good for the intended role that he plays. So again, you could even give him a Phoenix Gem, go the extra mile, and have him charge into things in the backfield and actually win, because he's not bad in combat. Unfortunately, no Banshee Mask, no Manda Blasters. He doesn't get any of that cool stuff, but he does have a jet bike, so it does make him a little bit tougher. So I think he's a B tier. It's not spectacular, but not terrible either. Next, we have the Autarch Wayleaper, and this has been a staple in pretty much every Eldar list since the beginning, so he's going to be an S tier. Being a lone op, having the option to take a Phoenix Gem, being very fast-moving, and also giving +1 leadership to units within 6, it's all good. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've played games against things like Tyranids, and I've positioned my Autarch Wayleaper in such a way that even when they use their Battle Shock abilities, I'm just there at +1 leadership. I'm rolling 5s. And it has saved me before from being Battle Shocked. So I really like him a lot. I think he's a really good character. And he's just good in every way to me. And he can definitely score in Pariah Nexus on things like command insertion, which is awesome. He's also a lone op, so he can do Unbroken Wall. I know a lot of people think Unbroken Wall is going to be something for, Custodes players or Death Guard players with really tough units. But I've actually found that if you're very aggressive with the rest of your army and your opponent doesn't have a lot of tools left in the late game, lone ops that are still alive can hold an objective pretty much just as well because they can't be shot off it, right? So there's no more things in the game that just ignore lone operative. There's no more Thousand Suns players who can just say, oh, Doombolt ignores it, right? They can't do that anymore. They have to follow the regular rules just like everybody else with lone operative. So I think because of that, the Autarch Wayleaper is in even better position. And he didn't get nerfed, which is nice. Because I thought he was going to get a points nerf, and it turns out that they nerfed other things. So that's awesome. So yeah, Autarch Wayleaper, really good character, S tier. Oh, and something else I didn't mention about the Wayleaper, because he has the ability to take the Banshee Mask, he's actually a good heroic intervener as well, especially now at 1 CP. If you really need something to defend against a small unit of Marines coming in, you need to defend something like a support weapon. If you're still running support weapons, or you're still running, fragile units, like even just a Farseer in the backfield, right? I've had opportunities to heroically intervene to save a Farseer, and sometimes it's worth the CP, So basically, your opponent's not going to want to overcommit to something like a Farseer, but they may commit 5, assault intercessors or something like that. And if your Autarch Wayleaper heroically intervenes in, he can actually kill just enough of them to prevent your Farseer from dying, which has happened. It's happened in game. So it is something to keep in mind that he can also heroically intervene very effectively with the Banshee Mask. Okay, let's move on to the Avatar of Khaine. Avatar of Khaine is another S tier unit, and that is because he is extremely tough, but he's also cheaper than your other units that you would use to hold primary. And he exerts more board control than a lot of other units as well. Like the other 2 units you would use for primary are Wraithguard and Wraithblades, and perhaps even dual Wraithlords. Now I think dual Wraithlords is something that might come back into prominence because it is cheaper than the Avatar of Khaine, and it's more durable against mortal wounds and stuff like that. Speaking comparatively, it also has technically more OC, on objectives. He has 6 OC versus 5 of the Avatar of Khaine. So there's some arguments there as to what you'd want to use. But the Avatar of Khaine is just so tough. And he's tough against stuff that Wraith Lords aren't. Things like Last Cannons, Melta Weapons. It has that 4+ invul save. It has the half damage ability, right? And it's just very, very strong. And because it's a single entity, you can fortune it and your opponent can't really get around it. They just kind of have to go into it. And the only things that can really deal with the Avatar of Khaine are mortal wounds, things like grenades, tank shock, etc. And the good thing about tank shock, guys, is that if somebody tries to tank shock you, the Avatar has Overwatch. That's right. If you position the Avatar in such a way that you can overwatch the enemy tank before it comes in, it's probably going to die. Unless it's a huge tank like a Land Raider, in which case you're going to have to get lucky to kill it. But even so, taking out half the wounds or more on a Land Raider as it comes in is pretty epic. And there's no guarantee that a Land Raider is going to be able to kill the Avatar of Khaine anyway, even with the high toughness that it has. So yeah, the Avatar of Khaine is looking pretty awesome, and in general I think it's just a great choice for most Eldar builds. Again, you're going to have to build into them though, because the Avatar of Khaine does have its weaknesses, so you're going to have to cover those weaknesses with other units in your army, because it is a fair chunk of points. Okay, next up, and one last thing, of course, the aura is awesome. A lot of people forget about the aura, but it is +1 to advance rolls and +1 to charge rolls within 6, which includes himself, but also includes units that are using heroic intervention. So again, if you support him right, you can have a unit waiting to countercharge an enemy unit 6 inches away, and you will get an easier heroic intervention charge if, again, he's within 6, which he should be, because you need to basically target heroic intervention within 6 of the unit that's being charged, and his aura is 6 inches, so you should be able to actually get that H in every time, that +1 to charge. Okay, next up is the old Yin-Karn, and the Yin-Karn is an A-tier unit. It's not quite as good as it used to be because it can't just teleport anywhere it wants to, which was kind of broken anyway, but it's extremely good at just kind of being patient and waiting for a great opportunity to strike and exploiting your opponent's weaknesses, which is what Eldar are all about anyway, so it kind of really fits that style of play. Now, it's still tough. It still does a lot of damage, but a couple things you have to know. One, it does less damage than the Avatar of Khaine, and it is technically less durable than the Avatar of Khaine. So those are two things you have to consider. The Yin-Karn is not going to be able to stand on an objective like the Avatar of Khaine is, so I think the best way to use him is just, kind of sit him on your home objective, sit him in the backfield, kind of hidden from enemy eyes, and then in the late game, pop out where your opponent's line is about to break them, and then control that area of the battlefield with the Yin-Karn. And that's kind of how I believe you should use the Yin-Karn, and it's a good model. It's excellent. I think you do have to kind of build into it a little bit, and you have to use an army that is very aggressive and can break things very fast and can destroy enemy units very quickly, which is a lot of Eldar builds. So unless you're running something that is, just based on, being really tough and things like that, I think you should be fine with the Yin-Karn. I think the Yin-Karn is very effective. Okay, next up is the Eldrad Ulthran. And Eldrad, I think, is B tier. Now, I think he's good, don't get me wrong. I just think he's kind of too expensive, and he feels like a luxury. Every time I want to put Eldrad in my list, I'm cutting something that the list really needs. And unfortunately, he's just not cheap enough to, fit in. I really do think Eldrad's good, but I don't think he's worth 110 points. Unfortunately, GW didn't buff him. I think he's more... if he was 90 points, I think more people would take him. But it's really hard to get Doom off against a target you want to because he's not that fast, right? He's kind of slow. You can put him with a Storm Guardian or even a Guardian Defender squad, which, again, it's kind of weird because if you put him with those units, then he might not even be in a position to use Doom or Mind War most of the game against the targets that you want. If you run him solo, he's going to use his stuff. He's going to come from reserve, Doom, Mind War, do all that, but then probably die afterward. So that is a problem, especially with the nerf to Phantasm. I think, when I was using him before the nerf to Phantasm, I was using him to come in on a board edge and then just Phantasm back behind terrain. and he would live for like 3 or 4 turns sometimes out of reserve. Well, 3, excuse me, not 4. But he would live basically either the entire game or he would die in the last turn because, you know, I would use him more aggressively at that point. But yeah, he was really good with Phantasm. Unfortunately, without the Phantasm, he just kind of has trouble living after he comes in, and that's an issue, right, at 110 points. So I think he's B tier, though, still, because he does generate you extra fate dice. He does give you +1 to wound, which is good in some matchups, but it's useless in other matchups, or not that great in some matchups. And he gives you Mind War, which a lot of people discount because there are better precision weapons in our army, things like the Solitaire, of course, and, you know, stuff that, you know, has precision, like the Death Jester, for example. But he still is pretty good. Mind War is good against characters, and there's a lot of things in the game that have the character keyword that you can actually just snipe out with the, you know, with Eldrad. So that is pretty powerful. Okay, so that's Eldrad Ulthran. Pretty cool, again, but, you know, kind of weird in a way because he doesn't really get to use his abilities. Illic Nightspear, and I know somebody in particular in my Discord will be upset at this, and I'm sorry ahead of time, but Illic Nightspear, because of the recent nerf that he got, basically his unit ability is now 18 inches instead of 12, if I read that correctly. He is now C tier. And the only reason I'm not putting him in D is because of respect, because I respect him, and he is fairly cheap, so you have to keep that in mind as well, and he does buff Rangers considerably. If you are running him with a unit of 10 Rangers with the idea that he's going to go after characters with his unit, I think that's totally fine. However, other than that, he really doesn't have a lot of use. He doesn't really protect his unit that well because his ability got nerfed, and he really doesn't kill characters himself that well. It's mostly his unit that does most of the killing if you're running him with a big Ranger unit, and that's a big investment. And I just think for me, I just don't like the unit enough anymore. I never really was a fan of the big Ranger squad with him because I always felt like that was just, you know, it was too much of an investment, and a lot of my opponents in particular had units that could kind of, you know, deep strike into range and then shoot him anyway, which was a problem, right? One of my main opponents runs Inceptors with the Bolters, and even before all the nerfs, if we go back to, like, for example, when Phantasm was a 7-inch move, if you're deep striking just outside of 3 inches, with Phantasm you get to 10, and maybe, just maybe, you can actually roll the Outcast ability to be able to get a couple more inches out, right? Maybe. But then they changed it a little bit, so you can't really do that as easily with Phantasm, because Phantasm is a D6. So you're rolling 2d6 and hoping that you can get out of range. You're just not going to be able to get out of range. Now, the other thing is that now that it's 18 inches, you're just not going to be able to do that at all. Because you're not going to have, even if you roll double sixes, you're not going to be able to get out of range of some of those 3-inch deep strikers. And even so, even if you're not going against 3-inch deep strikers, you know, a bad roll on Phantasm and the Outcast ability will just basically, you know, guarantee that your unit's going to die. So I'm not a big fan of them. They're not very survivable. They're kind of a unit that wants to sit in the backfield and just shoot, and I just don't find the use in units that do that for the most part for the Eldar, right? I just don't like, you need to be moving. In my opinion, the only things that should be in the backfield not moving a lot and shooting are things like fire prisms and maybe some indirect fire if you're taking it, and that's it. And even those units arguably should be doing some sort of movement. So the fact that Rangers just kind of want to sit there again with their, you know, heavy weapons and just kind of fire at whatever, you're just not going to get that many targets. So I think he's definitely a C tier unit, unfortunately, and that's kind of where he's going to stay. Okay, next up is Yvraine. Yvraine is an A tier unit. She's good. She does great damage against infantry. You know, anti-infantry 2+ devastating wounds is awesome. She is unfortunately nerfed, and I think that's one of the reasons why she's not an S tier, because even though she gives some great, you know, durability to Harlequins, and she's great on her own as well, 125 points is a steep price to pay, and I think she really did pay the quote-unquote tax for Ynnari. I think that was just a hit on Ynnari, that's it. They wanted to increase the cost of Ynnari without, you know, nerfing Dark Eldar. Which, by the way, I'm just going to go on a quick rant about Dark Eldar really quick. My buddy who plays him has been winning every single game he's played in Pariah Nexus by insane margins. I have a game against him coming up, and I'm shaking in my boots. Because basically what he's doing is he's running a bunch of Cobblites in Venoms and Raiders, and he's just destroying everybody with the rules as they're written with, you know, free pivots and stuff like that. He's charging at a deep strike basically by pivoting, which is all perfectly legal as far as it goes, and our group usually just plays rules as written. So he's just wrecking everybody. And the triple Archon that you can throw in there with, you know, basically stacking minus, you know, or +1 to command points on stratagems is just wrecking my opponents. So I don't know exactly. I'm going to have to figure out what to do myself. But, you know, Dark Eldar are looking absolutely crazy in Pariah Nexus. They're looking very good, especially with reduced deployment zones and stuff like that. It's just, it's madness, guys. It's madness. And I'll do a video on that coming up. Okay, so Yvraine is good. She's really good with large Harlequin troops, makes them more durable. She's good herself with the damage she deals. She's still good. People are still going to take her. That little 2-inch pivot thing that she has to pay for, actually there's a way around it where you just don't pivot. And I know that seems weird, but you just don't pivot her. You put Harlequins in front of her. You have her in a position where she doesn't pivot, but she can still, on consolidation, base with one of the Harlequins that's in engagement range with enemy units, and she's fine. She won't have to pay the extra 2 movement or anything like that because she never pivoted. So just don't pivot her. Position her initially where she doesn't have to pivot. That's it. I know people, you know, sometimes that's not always possible, but if she's in the middle of the unit, it's never going to matter really, right? It's only when she's run solo or when she's out in the front. When I know a lot of people like to put her in the front and stuff like that because she can guarantee, you know, being in engagement, but she's not really needed in engagement a lot of the times. She does good damage. But, you know, if it's between that and not making the charge, you should always just try to go for the charge. Okay, next up is her boyfriend, the Visarch. And the Visarch is A tier as well. He's excellent. He's great in a Harlequin unit, gives them fights first. Fights first is awesome now, and it kind of gives the Harlequins everything they need to just be just an excellent unit. He's great with Yvraine and a big blob of them, and he's also really good by himself in a Falcon with 5 Harlequins. Or not by himself, but, you know, joined with them. Because they give him +1 to wound. They give him, you know, out of a Falcon, he gets rerolls to wound. He's getting sustained hits too on his attacks. He gets to choose between 3 different things. He can even do dev wounds if he wanted to. Which, out of a Falcon against a tough target, is very good. If you're needing to kill a, you know, Catan Shard, you're needing to kill something very tough, you know, an enemy avatar of Khaine perhaps, and you just need a couple more mortal wounds, that can definitely be the ticket. Although I think in that case, it's better to just force as many wounds as possible. But, you know, still, you know, devastating wounds is still good. So yeah, the Visarch is very, very strong. Okay. Next up is the Farseer. And the Farseer is S tier. Now, personally, I do think it's very good. I don't think it's as good as the Skyrunner in the current meta, truthfully. But I still think it's pretty good. Fortune is really good with the Avatar. It's a key piece in a lot of lists because a lot of people run Avatar of Khaine or Wraithguard, and in those types of lists, the Farseer is needed for that +1 to wound. But also, it's useful in lists that don't have those units. Like, for example, a couple of balanced data slates past, I liked to run a Farseer solo, and I would just use his Fortune on Storm Guardians basically to ensure that they survive to stickify objectives. And a lot of the times, my opponent was unwilling to, you know, kind of reveal a more expensive unit, maybe a unit of Stern Guard veterans or something like that. My opponent wasn't willing to put that on the line to kill some Storm Guardians. So it was really cool seeing my opponent shoot a bunch of bolters from, you know, infiltrators or inceptors or whatever it is, just to be wounding on 4s and not fully kill the unit because they didn't want to fully commit to the Storm Guardian squad. And that was actually really good. So in certain situations, a Farseer can be good even in a list without the Avatar of Khaine, Wraith Lords, Wraithguard, whatever, those tough units. Because +1 to wound, you know, or -1 to wound, I should say, for enemies No, it'd be +1 to wound. Sorry, it's the negative basically. They're at -1 to wound, so that makes sense. Messed up a little bit there, but you know what I mean. What fortune does basically is makes the unit tougher. So against things like, even on jet bikes, which are toughness 4, all of a sudden become pretty durable against bolter fire, right? So Farseer can have other uses besides just the Avatar of Khaine, but a lot of players will prioritize the Skyrunner in lists that focus on damage. So Farseer's good. I still think he's S tier because he's an automatic include in lists that have other really good units like the Yinkarn and the Avatar of Khaine. Okay, next up is the Farseer Skyrunner, which is S tier. And I think it's probably the better choice overall because it does more damage, it's more mobile, it has guide, so it increases your damage against other targets better, and on top of it all, if you join him with Wind Riders, he gets to benefit from their ability. So for example, if you don't need to use guide on the Wind Riders, maybe you're shooting at the closest target, which is also on an objective. By the way, they did change that. It's no longer separate effects. You have to basically have both of them to be affected now. He's great, right? He can guide something else, and he can get the rerolls from the Wind Rider. And it acts as a great bodyguard. A unit of 9 Wind Riders is very tough for an opponent to deal with, especially when you're using things like Fire and Fade. So, yeah, the Farseer Skyrunner, great pick. He has basically also, right, in the Farseer as well, they both have the ability to change a fate dice to a 6, which is useful. And, in my opinion, auto-includes in almost every list. There's not a single list I can think of out there that wouldn't benefit from either a Farseer or a Farseer Skyrunner. I know there are some builds that don't use them, but I think with the changes, you're going to see a lot more of them in general. All right. Next up is the Spirit Seer. And the Spirit Seer, I'm going to just go ahead and put in B tier. I think it's good. It's just that because of the power that Wraiths had is severely reduced. I think the Spirit Seer is probably not as good as it used to be. I would say it used to be an A tier unit. Now I think it's more of a B tier. Obviously, it's an auto include with Wraith units, but because Wraith units are probably in a kind of lesser state than they were. And by the way, guys, it's mostly because melee armies are really dominating now. The thing about Wraith Blades and Wraith Guard is they're really durable against shooting, right? With a 2+ armor save, toughness 7, fortune, all that stuff. But in melee combat, they're really not that strong, right? Something like 8-bound charges into them, or, Death Company or something like that, they're just going to fold very quickly. And, it's unfortunate, but that's the kind of meta we're in right now. So the Spirit Seer really doesn't lend much to that, especially if something has precision attacks in combat. It's going to die really quick, and you're not going to even be able to res anything. So it is good. If you're running a huge Wraith Brick, it's still going to be an auto-include to put it in there. But, it's lost the ability to take Fate's Messenger and be able to benefit Wraithguard. It's, kind of lost some power, because Wraithguard have lost power and things like that. So, yeah, just in general, unfortunately, Spirit Seer is a little bit less needed, but it is still good if you have a big Wraith Brick. Okay, and I'm really hoping for a Wraith detachment to kind of bring Wraithguard back up to where they need to be. I think that's going to be the key. Alright, single Warlock. B tier. However, the only reason why I'm putting him in B tier is because I think he's a little too expensive. 45 points is a pretty penny. If he was 35, he'd be A tier. The reason why is because in Pariah Nexus, people are going to be running Storm Guardians and Guardian Defenders, and guess what, guys? Warlocks are actually a really good choice for those units. They do increase the cost of the unit by 50%, but they give them an automatic advance roll of a 6 or -2 to charges, which are both useful in the current meta that we're in. So I think that Warlocks are a decent choice for those units, and I actually think it's probably better in a Storm Guardian squad, but you can definitely put them in Guardian Defenders as well, and if your opponent's really melee heavy, that -2 to charges is really useful. So I actually do very much like the Warlock. A little bit expensive, and that's, again, the only reason why it's B tier. I think it's a 35-point model at best. And for some reason, GW has it at 45, and they've never changed it, even though people really haven't ever run Warlocks in competitive lists outside of a few very bizarre and weird cases. So, yeah, I think it should be cheaper. I think it's a shame that GW doesn't look at these guys more and say, wow, no one's running these in competitive play. I wonder why. Gee. You know, guys, it's because they're not priced well. They need to be 10 points cheaper to be even included in a unit like that. And, you know, I don't like to compare characters to other armies, but when you look at the difference between like a Warlock, for example, and something from another army like a Commissar, it's miles different, right, in abilities. And well, I'll say this, not in abilities, but in their stat line alone, you could just tell. It's like, yeah, the Commissar is much better than a Warlock. And that shouldn't be, right? The only thing the Warlock has is the 4+ invulnerable save, but it has only 2 wounds, right? Which doesn't make any sense. I mean, the character should be at least 3 wounds, but anyway, I'm going kind of off on a tangent now. But yeah, the Warlock I just think is kind of a little bit overpriced. Warlock Skyrunner is awesome. Also, I'm going to even say it's A tier. Now, the reason I say it's A tier versus the B tier of the Warlock on foot is because Ignores Cover is truly powerful and it also has -1 to hit 4 Wind Riders. You're only going to really use it with Wind Riders, but if your Wind Riders are destroyed and the Warlock somehow survives, it does become its own unit, and as its own unit, it's pretty decent. It's able to do objectives, it's fast, it has a decent number of range attacks, right? It has the Singing Spear, Destructor, and the Shuriken Catapult, all which you can fire in a single turn. That's something. So, you know, it's not a bad character. Again, it's a little bit expensive for what it is based on its stat line, but because it buffs its unit in such a big way with Ignores Cover and -1 to hit, especially with the way that you run Wind Riders, I think it is a solid choice. I don't think it's necessarily required for a unit of Wind Riders if you have things like Vipers or other things that can ignore cover, but it's definitely a good option for that squad. So I think it's good, essentially, is what I'm saying, especially when you run it with Wind Riders. Okay, next up is the Solitaire. The Solitaire is S tier for sure. Why is it S tier? Well, guys, because the Solitaire essentially has become something of an enigma in Pariah Nexus because it can score objectives from turn 1 because it has high speed, secondary objectives I should say, and it also has lone operative so it can't be shot at. On top of that, it also has fights first and has a bunch of attacks that kill Marines. It's basically the perfect lone operative for Pariah Nexus because it hits all the check marks that you would need to have a successful unit for scoring objectives and also killing in Pariah Nexus. And by the way, guys, also has precision, just saying, so if you need to kill a character really badly on an objective, it's got you covered too with a blitz. It gives it +3 attacks. You're hitting on 2s, you're strength 6 most of the time against most characters, you're wounding on 3s, and it's just a really powerful model in general. I like running it out of a Falcon because that gives me rerolls to wound. So if I need to roll against something that's toughness 6, which I need 4s to wound, guess what, guys? I'm rerolling all those wounds. So I might get all of the hits or most of the hits on a 2+. Maybe I hit 11 times. And then when I roll to wound, instead of like getting 5 or 6 wounds, I'm getting like 7 or 8. And your opponent making 7 or 8 invulns, usually that's going to end up in 8 damage because they're going to fail half of those. Most of the time, the Solitaire kills whatever it hits on blitz turn. It's very strong. So, yeah, I like using it that way big time. Big time. Oh, but just remember, you have to disembark before the transport moves because you have to declare your blitz when you move. You can't advance with it. So just keep that in mind as well. You can't move your transport and then disembark and then, you know, use your blitz. It's not possible. Because, again, remember, if you move your transport first, you can't charge. So yeah, it has incredible threat range as well, right? With the blitz, it gets +2d6 movement. So it's just a great model overall. It's very versatile. It can play defensively. It can play offensively. It can play the objective game. It can do everything. It is 115 points, but each and every point is well worth it, in my opinion. The only reason he wasn't getting a lot of play before was because people were using a lot of vehicles, and he's really not good into vehicles. That's it. Okay, Death Jester, also S tier. For some of the same reasons that the Solitaire is S tier. It's great because it's fairly quick, it can score on objectives, but it also has a great shooting attack. With Fate's Messenger, you can pump out an average of 9 Shuriken Cannon shots per turn. And if that wasn't enough, his Shuriken Cannon has devastating wounds. And he also forces Battle Shock tests, which is more useful in Pariah Nexus, because there are a few secondaries that require you to live until the end of your opponent's turn. Not your own turn, but the end of your opponent's. So the Death Jester being able to Battle Shock enemy units and cancel their secondaries is excellent. But chances are, if the unit is small enough, he's probably just going to kill that unit anyway. So really just awesome model in general for denying secondaries, picking up secondaries himself, surviving, dealing damage. He's just really good. Also, just like the Solitaire, he's on a small base. He's really easy to Phantasm, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of people have an opinion about Phantasm that it's worthless now, and I think for the most part, on most units in the Eldar book, it is worthless. I'm just going to say that because it's true. But there are situations you will come in a game where it can deny a charge from your opponent. It can deny your opponent the ability to shoot at that unit. I love using Death Jesters just to move behind walls again. Even if I roll a 1, I can still move from the other side of the wall basically pretty easily because it has a very small base. So basically, if you guys don't know this, you can actually put the Death Jester in the corner, right? So you can put it just peeking out just a little bit out of the wall so he can shoot a target, and then you could move him back, right? But in most cases, because walls are so thin, you actually do have the movement to just move to the other side of the wall with the small base that the Death Jester has. I don't think you can do that with 28mm, but I'm pretty sure you can do it with the 25mm. So yeah, the Death Jester is really good. No doubt one of the best lone operatives in our book right now. Next up is the Troupe Master. The Troupe Master is an A-tier unit, really buffs Harlequins, gives them devastating wounds, has an ability where you can turn a 1 that you use for a fate dice to a 6, which is really, really decent for Overwatch and things like that. I've had situations where I've Overwatched with him just to burn a bad fate dice, and his fusion pistol, his fusion pistol actually just popped a Space Marine right off the bat. So, not the best, but still pretty good if you get my drift. And in general, just giving a unit devastating wounds for only 55 points, that's pretty amazing. So I like him. I think he's a great unit, and he's going to be seeing a lot of play in Pariah Nexus, especially since he can turn troops into battle. If he's your warlord, obviously. So I think that's not going to be the case for most Eldar armies out there, but if you're running a Quinn's list, it's definitely powerful. Next up is the Shadowseer, and I used to put the Shadowseer in D tier, but I actually think it's more of a C tier unit now. It's still bad, don't get me wrong, but because Pariah Nexus, is a little bit different, a unit that can, kind of advance and charge just on foot in the first turn is pretty cool. So, yeah, it's a decent model. It gives its unit advance and charge, and you can reroll advance rolls, so that's good. It's just kind of, to me, it's just a little bit too expensive still. It doesn't do enough for the unit. It doesn't give its unit any extra damage. So it's useful if you're running a Harlequin list, but it's not going to be good in comparison to things like the Troupe Master or Yvrain, or the Visarch. So it's decent, but only if you really, have nothing else to spend your points on, right? Like in the past, I would say, oh, just take a unit of 5 troops. So like, just way better. But now it's like, well, I mean, if you don't want just a unit of 5 troops on foot or something like that, I guess you could just throw in a Shadowseer into your list, right? Somewhere. And it could be useful, but still not a fan. Still think that, its defensive ability should be better. I just think they really did the Shadowseer dirty this edition, but, that's my personal opinion. Okay, so next up is Prince Riel. Now, Prince Riel is... I'm going to put him actually in B tier. I think he's really not the best out there. I think if you build into him and you build the army into him, he can be good. But the problem is that he's supposed to be with Corsairs, and you would think he'd be really good in Corsairs, but he's kind of more of a fluff pick in that army because, yes, he gets to, you get to redeploy, which is powerful with Scout, but that only really works with certain builds. So he's really only good in certain builds, and outside of that, he's not anything, right? Like, I would use him in an army that had, like, a lot of big stuff. Like, if I was running, like, Avatar of Khaine, Skathach Wraithknight, Yin Karn. I possibly would use Prince Riel in something like that, like a Monster Mash list. Or in a list that's using Scout or Infiltrate a lot, I would definitely use Prince Riel in something like that. But, those lists aren't really competitive. They're more of like, themed list, I would say. So I think he's good in certain themed lists, which is why he's in B tier for me, because I love themed lists. But I don't think he's actually powerful enough to be competitive. So in general, I just think he sits in B tier. And unfortunately, just like him and Illic, he's probably not going to survive the Codex. But we'll see. Maybe he will be in the Codex. Okay, so next is Corsair Void Reavers. I think these guys are A tier for now. And the reason I say A tier for now is because I'm convinced that they're a good battle line unit for scoring objectives and stuff like that in Pariah Nexus. And they deal decent damage against Marines with their power weapons and all that. You definitely want to give them power weapons. I think that's the best way to go in Pariah Nexus. But they're kind of expensive still. 75 points for 5 is a little bit pricey for what they do. They're fragile, and you really have to get first turn with them for them to be effective, or you have to hide them very well. And if you don't get first turn with them, and there's no mission rule that benefits battle line, they're kind of just average, right? I mean, unless you're getting a mission rule that benefits battle line, they're just not super good. So I would say they're a good unit in certain missions, but there's other missions that are not, which is why I'm tentatively putting them in A tier. Realistically, I think they're probably more of a B tier unit, right? I think that's more realistic, but I'm going to be optimistic with them and say that, they're, because of the new mission rules and Pariah Nexus and all those changes, that they're, kind of more in the A tier category, but maybe on the lower end. Corsair Void Scarred, on the other hand, are a B tier unit. I think they're good, but they're expensive, right? If they were less expensive, they'd be better. They'd be an A tier. They give precision and lethal hits against a chosen unit at the beginning of the game. I think that's really good on a melee unit, right? Especially if you can charge in with Scout turn 1 because the deployment zones are more close together. If they were cheaper, I think that would be so good. But unfortunately, they're expensive. And if you take them, and you can't really take them in a unit of 5 that often because they don't get all the special rules and benefits in a unit of 5. So you need a unit of 10, which means a Wave Serpent. Now, they can be good in a Wave Serpent because they have Scout. They confer that to the Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent can move 7. And if you get first turn, they can disembark, charge something, and they can be really effective at ripping that unit apart. But, once again, if you choose to put your Vrain or, any other character in there, they lose that Scout ability. So they have to kind of be by themselves. And they're kind of too expensive, in my opinion, for that role. But they are very good, don't get me wrong. They're just a little bit expensive. Okay. Next up is Dark Reapers. Dark Reapers are, in my opinion, a B tier unit. I think they went from A tier to B tier because the indirect fire of the Tempest Launcher got nerfed, and they also got a points decrease. So they're less cost efficient than they were before, which is a big deal with them because, like all aspect warriors, they have to be cost effective. They have to make good trades, and I just don't think Dark Reapers make as good of a trades as they have before. They're still good, though. I think that as a B tier unit, you can still see them in lists running, the Tempest Launcher as a utility pick for things like Cultists, Gretchen, those types of units that your opponent wants to use to capture objectives and stuff like that, hold objectives in the backfield. They're still very good against those units. They're just not as good against other stuff. So against units of 10 that are very light infantry that are going to be wounding on 3s, it's still good, but otherwise it's just not as good as it was before. There's a big difference between hitting on 3s and hitting on 4s when you're rolling a lot of dice. So nowadays, you really need 2 units of these guys to be able to kind of guarantee that you're going to wipe up a Cultist squad, and you might even need to cast Guide. You might even need to cast Guide on one unit just because, it's kind of dicey. Hitting on 4s, it's a little bit unreliable. So, if you have a lot of shots and you're, spewing out 9 shots with the Tempest Launcher, it used to be that you'd hit 6 times. Now it's like you'll hit maybe 4, maybe 5 times, which is a big difference when you're using 2 units up to, achieve that goal. So, yeah, I think they're, pretty much B tier now. However, I will say this. They are still good against light vehicles if you can get direct line of sight with the actual Reaper launchers themselves. They're still good against things like Venoms. Anything with, toughness 7 or less, they're still very effective against. Okay, next up is Dire Avengers. Dire Avengers are B tier as well. They're nothing special. I won't put them in C tier or D tier. I know some of you guys really hate them and think they're like the worst unit in the codex, but because of the point changes, they're actually more cost effective at dealing damage than Swooping Hawks now. Swooping Hawks are 85 points, and Dire Avengers are 70. So, yes, you're losing one shot with the Dire Avengers, but because the Viper also got decreased in points, you can easily use the Viper to ignore cover on a unit, which makes Dire Avengers hit harder. So there is some argument to having Dire Avengers in some lists if your opponent is using a lot of infantry. So I think Dire Avengers are in a better spot than they were, weirdly enough, because of the cost or decreasing cost of the Viper. Being able to ignore cover on an infantry unit and then hitting them with the Dire Avengers means their AP1 actually makes a difference. However, I will say this. They're still kind of slow for Aspect Warriors. They're fragile, and they're probably not going to survive long if they're anywhere within 18 inches of enemy units. And that's basically just what it is, right? The advantage of Swooping Hawks is that they can score objectives. They can also, shoot at 24 inches. They have a lot of different things they can do. Dire Avengers really only do one thing. They're going to try to get into the midboard behind some terrain. They're going to shoot at something, deal some decent damage, and then they're probably going to die after they overwatch something. And that's basically the lot of Dire Avengers. I think they're just okay. But, again, I think that they're weirdly better in Pariah Nexus than they were in Leviathan. So that is a bonus. And, Asurmen did get a points decrease, so that's also a thing. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about Howling Banshees. Howling Banshees are A tier. Just like Jain's are, the ability to heroically intervene for cheaper now, and also fights first, is very strong. You might think Howling Banshees aren't that good because they can't kill a full unit of Marines, but you don't need to. Usually, when an opponent uses a melee unit to charge into one of your other units, you just need to kill enough of the enemy to where their attacks aren't going to be as powerful and they're not going to be able to fully kill your unit off. So let me give you a quick example. Let's say your opponent is charging 5, maybe Legionaries or something like that, into a unit of Swooping Hawks or Warp Spiders. Now, they're going to deal some decent damage. I believe Legionaries have like 3 attacks apiece at strength 4. That's enough to usually kill a unit of, light infantry. A small unit. Now, that's going to be some real problems for the Warp Spiders. But if you can heroically intervene some Banshees in there, you can take out most of the charging unit before you even have to worry about it, which means your Warp Spiders are going to be just fine. You might lose a couple Warp Spiders, but you're not going to lose the full unit. They're not going to be battle shocked, most likely. And because they're not going to be battle shocked, because they're not under 50%, that, of course, means that you're able to score on objectives much easier and stuff like that without problems. So I think, Howling Banshees is a very good defensive unit. And again, they're mostly going to be, in my opinion, a unit that is going to be with Jain's R perhaps, or maybe even by themselves. You can use them in reserve to rapid ingress. I still think that's a very viable strategy. They can, heroically intervene as well if you need them to, which is awesome. Now, the other thing I want to mention is heroic intervention with rapid ingress is something that you might want to consider as well. In certain circumstances, it can be worth it to rapid ingress a unit of Howling Banshees in a position where they can later that turn heroically intervene on, the part of the unit that's going to be charged. Or on behalf of that unit, I should say. So that's very strong, right? Having a unit just pop up anywhere you want to and be able to heroically, again, I know it's 2 command points total now, but it's much more doable than it was before. And you can definitely turn the tide of a battle if you make the right call on that. Jain's R and 5 Howling Banshees coming in via rapid ingress, heroically intervening for free against an enemy unit of Warp Talons jumping in and going to, jump on your support weapon or jump on your Guardians, and they're going to just kill all of them. That's really strong, guys. And especially with the nerf of Warp Talons to 135 points, it's a great trade too, because it's only a little bit less than they are. And you're going to probably wipe out the whole unit with Jain's R. It's really strong. I recommend, guys, if you're going against a lot of Chaos Space Marine players and they're running the Warp Talons, they're running a bunch of melee units, try Jain's R and 5 Howling Banshees, throwing them in reserve. rapid ingressing them, and then using heroic intervention to, prevent a charge from basically destroying one of your units. It's a really good tactic. I've used it several times and it's really awesome. So definitely try that out. I have a video on it when I talked about Howling Banshees and how useful that can be. But, you can check out that video on my channel if you want more details about that. But it can be really good in a lot of situations. So I really like that combination with Jain Zar. And yes, a lot of people are thinking Jain Zar and a Falcon. That's good too. But, Jain Zar and a Falcon, your opponent knows where they are. So a good opponent can kind of space their units out accordingly so that you can't heroically intervene, or you won't be in a position to heroically intervene on certain parts of the battlefield. Whereas heroic intervention, you can heroically intervene on the flanks of the battlefield much easier. So, that is something to consider. Next up is Fire Dragons. Fire Dragons are, of course, S tier. Even though they've got increased in points, the fact that they can go after transports, they can go after heavy infantry, they can go after extra heavy infantry, they can basically go after any kind of tough unit in the game and trade up. Even against land raiders, they trade up. And what I mean by that is, if you run them out of a Falcon, a lot of people say, oh, 5s to wound really suck. Yeah, it sucks, but if you have rerolls, you have about a 50% chance, and remember that the Fire Pike is strength 12, so that's wounding on 4s. So you're basically being able to reroll all your wounds. You get to reroll one of your hits against the Land Raider. And again, you might not kill the Land Raider outright, but you can do some serious damage against it, and a couple of Bright Lances should be able to finish it off. There's many situations where I've fired a Falcon into a Land Raider, disembarked my Fire Dragons, and done so much damage that it only took a couple of extra things to kill the Land Raider. The other option is if you have Fuegan, maybe not joined to them, but joined kind of like, as part of the assault, he can almost one-shot the Land Raider by himself. He hits on a 2+, he basically wounds on a 3+ with a reroll, so he's almost always going to wound. And your opponent gets essentially a 6-up save or die, unless they're in cover, which they get a 5+ save. And if they don't, you're doing 12 automatic wounds to them. And I'm telling you guys, the rest of the Fire Dragons are at least going to be able to deal 4 wounds between all of them, right? So you can definitely kill a Land Raider with something like that very easily. And I think they just trade up against most things in the game. They're a very good unit. It's why you see them in competitive lists. And at 90 points, they're still going to be really good. Oh, and they have grenades too. So again, like if all else fails, throw a grenade. Before you start shooting at that Land Raider, make sure you throw that grenade in, because that's 3 automatic mortal wounds that your opponent can't do anything against, which is awesome. Unless they're Black Templar and they get a 6-up, feel no pain. Okay, Scorpions are next. S tier. Now, normally I wouldn't say this, but I think the decrease in cost makes Scorpions both a contender for an infiltrating unit, being a unit that can screen and take out, scouting type units early on, tie up transports, all that kind of good stuff, and they're a hard-hitting melee unit with Karandras. I wouldn't have said this in September. I wouldn't have said this in November, but I think they are now an S tier unit because of the fact they can deal so much damage to enemy infantry. With Karandras, with a Falcon, they're just really amazing. They're a really amazing melee powerhouse. They compete with Harlequins for damage in that way. Harlequins with the Troupe Master and with all the different, grenade stratagem and the tricks they can do and the tank shock, they can do a lot of damage. Don't get me wrong. But Karandras and 5 Scorpions are now really powerful into a lot of basically anything except vehicles and monsters. They can do some serious damage against. And even vehicles and monsters, Karandras does some good damage himself. He can basically almost half-shot most monsters and vehicles in the game that are of medium quality, right? Because he has the ability to just deal devastating wounds to them. Especially if he's re-rolling wounds, which I think is key, right? If they're re-rolling wounds, they're just going to be dealing more damage anyway. Even if it's not going to kill the vehicle, they're going to punch up and punch significantly into it. So yeah, definitely an S tier unit as well, with the changes. Shadow Specters are next, and they're going to be A tier. I still think they're good, guys. I think the meta is shifting more towards, marine equivalents and stuff like that. but they're still a very versatile unit that can, cull hordes when you need to. They're very good against horde enemies, and they have some decent shots against light vehicles, right? Their weapons can deal with things like venoms and other, toughness 6 or lower transports. So again, they're good. They're a good unit. I don't think you should spam them though. I think maybe one unit is enough to kind of give you what you need for building a list. They also move, shoot, move, so they can kind of stay hidden throughout the whole battle, which is nice. It means that their damage is going to rack up over the course of the game, and your opponent's not going to have a lot of tools against it, especially with the nerfs to indirect fire. Okay, next up is the Shining Spears. Now, the Shining Spears, I want to put them in B tier, but realistically, I know they're a C tier unit. Now, the reason why is because they just have, especially with the new terrain that I see, it's going to be really hard to actually get them to engage properly with enemy units. And that's all it is, right? If they can actually hit an enemy unit, I think they're pretty good at 100 points. They're a little bit expensive, but they're still pretty good. However, I think there's a lot of units now that just outcompete them point for point in melee. Striking Scorpions, Harlequins, right? Howling Banshees. I think all those units really outcompete them point for damage. So I just don't think they're that great. At 100 points, they really need to be, like I've said before 100 times to, everybody who would listen. They really need to be 90 points, or they need to be treated as beasts when they charge. When they make a charge, they need to be treated as beasts so that they can actually charge through ruins and stuff like that, like infantry can. And, I mean, that would make sense, right? They're skilled riders. They're experts with the jet bike. They should be able to charge through ruins and stuff like that. I just don't understand why they don't have that ability. But, again, I mean, GW will do what they do. They're great looking models though, and if you can find a way to use them, I think the best way to use them is rapid ingress, having them in reserve, rapid ingressing down, and then charging in the opponent's back. Because, of course, as you guys know, ruins are from the front protected by a wall, which they can't charge through, but from the back, they're not. So you can actually, come behind an enemy unit, charge in. The only problem with that is your opponent can screen you. So they're really a late game cleanup unit, in my opinion, to kind of get around enemy units and then charge them in the back when you have the opportunity. Like any good light cavalry unit, right? So that's what I think they should be really played in, but, having to wait until turn 3 and then really almost being able to, by the time they do something, it's really turn 4, turn 5. They're just not having much of an impact on the game for the points you spend on them. Okay, next up is the Swooping Hawks. And they're still S tier, guys. There's no question about it. They did get increased in points, but you're still going to need them for missions in Pariah Nexus. They can move normally and still score on secondaries turn 1 because of the way the deployment zones are now. That's very powerful. And they can also, of course, as always, screen and then jump off the battlefield and be wherever you need them to be. They're a very versatile unit. Even if you just take one unit in your list, I'm currently only using one unit because I think that's kind of all I need currently in that build. But, one unit, 2 units, they're still going to be good even at 85 points. So don't worry about that. They're still great at objectives. They're still great at screening. And, of course, they're still very fast. And they deal some decent damage as well to infantry. And they can put some wounds on, tougher targets too with lethal hits. Warp Spiders are next up, and they're going to be S tier. Definitely S tier. And, I think they did get a points increase, of course, to 125, but that is because they can basically just not even care about advancing. They just move normally and score on objectives. So moving 24 inches with, deployment zones that are closer is very strong. And on top of that, just being able to just overwatch something in your deployment zone if you want to put them in a screening position early in the game is good too. They're a unit, and I've said this before with some of the other people that have come on the channel. They're just really a unit that you need to be patient with, right? Like, you need to wait for a good opportunity to use them. I think the best opportunity to use them personally in my own games has been to use them defensively for the first couple of turns and then jump forward when the opportunity presents itself to score an objective, to score that objective if the Warp Spiders are the only ones that can do it, right? And then even on top of that, if you don't want to lose the Warp Spiders, I think for 125 points, if you don't have a better target for Fire and Fade, they are a pretty good target for Fire and Fade, even a unit of 5. I know that may not seem like much, but if it saves the unit and it puts your opponent into a position where now they have to rethink their strategy going forward and how to deal with the Warp Spiders, that's a win. That's worth the 2 command points. I've said it before, sometimes you can use Fire and Fade on units you wouldn't even think are worth it if they throw a wrench into your opponent's plans. Like, let me give you another example. This one time I was using a unit of Fire Dragons out of a Wave Serpent. Oh, excuse me, a Falcon. And they were near enough to a piece of terrain where they could get behind the wall. Now, my opponent was under the impression that the Fire Dragons were going to be able to die. Then he was going to be able to, kind of both shoot and then charge Fuegan and kill him. But because I was able to kind of use Fire and Fade, I was actually able to put them into a position where my opponent couldn't kill the Fire Dragons and therefore couldn't actually get into contact with Fuegan as well because of consolidation. So it was a little bit of a weird situation, but basically, to wrap it up for you guys in a simple way, he was in range to charge the Fire Dragons, and his plan is that he was going to shoot Fuegan, kill him, and then Fuegan would have to revive in the same spot. He was going to charge the Fire Dragons and consolidate into Fuegan with some of the other Terminators that were in the unit, and the Terminators were going to finish him off, and the Fire Dragons as one. So that was his plan, but because I was able to Fire and Fade the Fire Dragons out of range, he couldn't do it. So he ended up just shooting Fuegan, he revived, and then Fuegan just, went on a rampage. But, that was a situation where Fire and Fade wouldn't have seemed useful, but in that particular instance, it was actually the best way I could have spent my command points. So there are situations where Fire and Fade on other units is really good, including Warp Spiders. And Warp Spiders, of course, move 12 inches. So they have a little bit of a better range with that as well. Okay, again, Warp Spiders, great unit, great defensive unit for screening and overwatching deep strikers, and also really good at scoring objectives. Okay, next unit is Storm Guardians, and you guys know what I think of these guys? They're S tier. Now, they were really good before, included in a lot of competitive lists, but I think they're even better now, of course, because Pariah Nexus made them so. There's mission rules that now give them bonuses, and they're really good with those bonuses. Advance in actions is really good with them. Being able to shoot or be in combat with actions is very good with them, right? The only thing I wouldn't say is that good is being in reserve turn 1 and coming out turn 1. But even that could be kind of good depending on the situation and deployment. So there's a lot of ways in which you can use Storm Guardians that are very awesome. So I really love Storm Guardians. They're one of my favorite units in the entire Eldar Index this edition. They make your objectives sticky, which is really good for Eldar, especially if you have a fast, aggressive play style. You want to put those sticky objectives down, move forward off the objectives. Have them screened, of course. Make sure they're not fully exposed, but, you don't have to spend a unit just sitting there, which is good. So really love Storm Guardians. And they punch up. Their damage is actually, believe it or not, better than Guardian Defenders against Marine equivalent units. And they're also better against Hordes because they have 2 Flamers in there. So, yeah, they have a shorter range than Guardian Defenders, but when they are in 12 inches, they do more damage. And by the way, point blank, that's just mathematically correct. The only thing that Guardian Defenders are better against is long-range tanks that are, on the tougher side, and that's only because of the Bright Lance. That's it. As far as their damage against Marine equivalents and other enemies like that, their damage is much less. Speaking of Guardian Defenders, A tier. They're a very good unit as well, don't get me wrong. They're great in Pariah Nexus. They have some of the same kind of benefits that Storm Guardians do. Not quite as many, but giving yourself extra fate dice to be able to use for your high, value units, like Fuegan, the Avatar of Khaine, things like that. I think Guardian Defenders are quite good. They're also good at screening your backfield. Now, the other thing about Guardian Defenders is they're actually pretty durable on objectives because they're going to be in cover, right? Indirect fire is nerfed, guys, so they're better against indirect fire. You have the Bright Lance, which is a good long-range weapon you can overwatch with, which is nice as well. They're just a solid unit. They're only 100 points too. They're pretty cheap, and they're a great place to put a Farseer. And yes, indirect fire is nerfed, but a Farseer will still die to indirect fire just because he's so fragile, right? Toughness 3 and a 4+ save isn't going to help him against a Basilisk or 2, right? People are still going to run Basilisks, even hitting on 4s. That's just going to be a thing. Okay, so Guardian Defenders, pretty solid in the right build. Crimson Hunters are next. Crimson Hunters are, I would say, an A tier unit. I know that's going to freak some of you guys out. I think they're on the lower side of A tier, but I think what gives them really good potential is their ability to ignore line of sight via obscuring terrain. So being able to pour 2 Bright Lances and a Pulse Laser into a high priority target that's trying to hide, that maybe doesn't necessarily have lone operative or maybe doesn't necessarily have any defensive capabilities except to hide behind terrain, is very powerful. This is really good against things like Dark Eldar because you're also going to get a +1 to hit, +1 to wound against most of their transports. So yes, they might be able to kill your, Crimson Hunter in return, but eliminating Dark Eldar transports, and I think Dark Eldar are going to be one of the best factions in the game, being able to kill those types of units really helps you be able to minimize their effectiveness. I'm actually going to use a Crimson Hunter just because I want to see how good it is in the matchup with my Dark Eldar buddy coming up. I think they're very good into that matchup. Now, there are matchups that they're not good into. Right? They're not good into a lot of infantry spam. If your opponent's just running a bunch of Marines and not a lot of tanks, they're not going to be very effective, right? But here's the other cool thing. If your opponent isn't running a bunch of things that can kill flyers, they're pretty much immune to getting charged. So if your opponent isn't running stuff with fly, your Crimson Hunter is perfectly safe. So Blood Angels, of course, they have a lot of jump packs and stuff. It's not going to work there. But if you're going against something like, let's say Chaos Space Marines or World Eaters, and they have a lot of things that are very powerful in combat that can kill your vehicles in combat, but they don't fly, then your Crimson Hunter can just wait, basically run around all game, popping transports, doing whatever it wants, and being relatively safe. The only thing you have to worry about, I should say, in a World Eaters list is Angron. And you can kind of stay away from Angron if you're smart, right? Angron is good, but, if you place your Crimson Hunter in position across the board from him, he's not going to be able to really damage it because he can't reach it. So, of course, the Crimson Hunter has its uses against several armies. And I think it's a good, it's a good flyer in general, considering that flyers are a little bit weaker this edition. So I like the Crimson Hunter. I think it's pretty good in certain matchups. But some people may disagree. That people may say it's a little bit cost inefficient, but it's only on one. To me, it's only 160. It's 20 points less than a Fire Prism. It ignores line of sight, which is a big deal. And again, 2 Bright Lances and a Pulse Laser with +1 to hit and wound against flying units isn't that bad. Okay, next up is the Hemlock Wraithfighter. That thing is D tier, and not only is it horrible in that it has a very low range on its weapons, but it hits on a 4+ for some reason, which is also really bad, and its weapons are really swingy. It has D6 shots. Yeah, you could get, on average, you'll probably get 7 shots out of it, but sometimes you'll get even worse, and you're hitting on 4s. You're really just not going to be doing a lot of damage. You'll be lucky to be killing 3 Marines with this thing coming out of reserve. That's just not enough for, something that I think is 155 points, which is insane for what it does. Its ability also sucks, being able to basically -1 to enemy battle shock within 9, but the fact is it's coming from reserve. It's not going to be able to use its ability when it comes in. So there you go. Basically, it's no more durable. I think the Crimson Hunter is even more durable because it has an invul save. The Hemlock doesn't. So it's just altogether a worse flyer, and it's also a flyer that, doesn't do anything our army could do anyway. So definitely D tier. The Hornet is really good. I think it's probably a B tier unit. The only reason I think that, it did get buffed, by the way, with Tank Shock. A little bit of a tiny buff for it. But the other thing is it can carry 2 Bright Lances, so it's kind of in the same vein as Warwalkers. The only problem is it's a little bit more fragile than Warwalkers. It does have 8 wounds. It does have toughness 7, which is a little bit more than the Warwalker, but it doesn't have -1 to wound or an invul. So it will go down faster than the Warwalker will. However, it does have the ability to generate mortal wounds. However, I think that the amount of mortal wounds it can generate is usually going to be around 6 per turn. Its ability can only be used against infantry and, I think, mounted units, but not vehicles and monsters. So that is useful if you can move over an enemy unit. Just most of the time, you're not going to be able to move over an enemy unit. that you want to move over. It's going to be something that's just kind of periphery, or, you know, unit of infantry that maybe you don't need it against. But it's good. You know, I think it's a good unit. I think the Hornet's probably better in lists that focus more on damage and less on, you know, kind of utility and stuff like that, because the Warwalker has Scout, has the invul save, and has -1 to wound, so it's tougher, it's more maneuverable in the early game, you know, can kind of play mind games with that Scout move. And in my opinion, the Warwalker is just probably the better choice overall. It's also smaller, right? So size does matter in Warhammer 40k, believe it or not, when it comes to hiding behind terrain and stuff like that. And the Warwalker is a little bit smaller, has a lower profile, so it makes it a little bit better in that regard. However, I still like Hornets. I think they're really good, and if you're going for more of an aggressive damage style list that's going to be, you know, pushing up the board very quickly, destroying enemy units, I think this can have a lot of good opportunities for destroying, you know, key units. The Night Spinner is next, and the Night Spinner, guys, is going to be D tier. Now, I've really soured on the Night Spinner over the last couple of months. First of all, yes, its ability is -2 movement, -2 advances, -2 to charges, which is nice and everything. But for much cheaper, you could just have a screening unit do the same thing, right? I could just have a unit of Rangers do the exact same thing and just screen for me for a turn, and it's about, you know, I could have 4 units of Rangers, basically, almost 4, for the cost of a single Night Spinner. And that's incredible to think about. The Night Spinner's damage is also very lackluster, especially with the nerfs, which actually, you know, in hindsight, don't really affect it too much, because it was always hitting on 4s basically anyway. But now it just seems like you really just don't do the damage necessary to actually warrant with it, and it's really expensive. It's just really not a good unit in my opinion. 210 points is way too much. A lot of the other indirect fire stuff got buffed, right? It got point decreases, like Imperial Guard, Artillery got point decreases because of the heavy nerf, and the Night Spinner didn't see anything. So really, just the Night Spinner is just out for me. It's absolutely useless. There's better units in its category. There's better uses for the points. It doesn't do a lot of damage, and its ability really just isn't that good in general, in my honest opinion. Next up is the Lynx. The Lynx is A tier. I like the Lynx. It's very fast. It hits hard on advance. You can move up to 23 inches with it and still shoot its weapon. It's very good. It's also a very long model, so it's good at move blocking and stuff like that. It's the same cost as a Fire Prism. It's a little bit tougher too. It has a 5+ invul, and I want to say 16 wounds, which is quite a bit more than other vehicles in our roster. So I do like the Lynx. It's cool to me. I don't own one, so I don't use it, and I don't know the exact dimensions of it either, so I've never proxied it in a game, you know, besides just, you know, telling my buddy, hey, is it okay if I use a Fire Prism proxy for this? You know, and my buddy was like, all right, that's fine. And I've used it one time, I think. It did okay. I think in the game I played it a little bit aggressive. It killed a couple things and then died itself, so it did all right for itself. I know that people that use the Lynx a lot or have the Lynx model love it and sing its praises. So, you know, for the most part, I'm going to agree with them that it is good. It's good on paper. I've used it myself in exactly one game where it did okay. I know that's not exactly a great test, but, you know, it's done pretty good for me. I can see the quality of it, you know, in the game, especially with terrain-dense boards and the changes in pivots and stuff. It seems pretty good, which was its weakness before. So, yeah, I'm going to say it's an A-tier unit. The Warp Hunter, however, is not. So the Warp Hunter, again, I'm going to just put it in D tier right off the bat. It's cool, but it does so little damage. Its weapon, and guys, if you're wondering where this is or where to find this, it's Imperial Armor. So you have to go on the app and go to Imperial Armor Warp Hunter. Just look at its weapon and how weak it is and tell me if it's worth taking. Personally, I think it's not, because it's the same cost as a Falcon. So I would always take a Falcon over this, because the Falcon does more damage, has a transport ability, and has a ability that's actually worth it, which is rerolls wounds. This doesn't have any of that. It does Battle Shock for its ability, which sucks. It has really low range on its weapons, which also suck. It's very fragile, and on top of that, its weapon doesn't do a lot of damage. So yeah, the Warp Hunter is one of the worst units in the index by far. Fire Prisms are good. I'm going to put them in A tier. However, just keep in mind that with the changes in Pariah Nexus, there are a couple of battlefields that it's not good in with the terrain setup. Terrain setups 7 and 8 seem extremely hard to run with a Fire Prism. I ran a Fire Prism in terrain deployment number 1 or number 2, I believe, earlier this month. Well, it would actually be late June, but it did good in that game, or they did, both of them. But I don't think it would have done good if I was in terrain setup 7 or 8. I think they would have had a lot of problems finding line of sight. So, word of the wise on Fire Prisms, if you're using them competitively, I think using them, if you notice that the terrain layouts at the event have clear lines of sight from one side of the board to the other, with terrain that you can hide behind, thumbs up to the Fire Prism. If you see that there's not a lot of places that you can draw a line of sight from one side of the battlefield to the other, Fire Prism probably not that good for the points. That's just what it is, right? So I'm going to put it in A tier. If it was good in every situation, I'd say it's S tier because it's really efficient. It gets full reroll state and wound against vehicles, and with its single or focus beams, and it can fire through other Fire Prisms, so it saves you on kind of being shot at and stuff like that. Fire and Fade is great on it. It does a ton of damage you don't have to use Fate dice for because it's flat damage, flat 6. It's good. Don't get me wrong. But certain terrain layouts aren't going to be good for it. So make sure that if you're planning to play this in a tournament, you study the terrain layouts and make sure that you have clear lines of sight to one side of the battlefield to the other. Next up is the Falcon. Falcon is S tier, guys. It's made it. It's cost effective at 140. It has a splintering array of good weaponry, which is awesome. Pulse Laser, Bright Lance, Shuriken Cannon make it very good at killing targets that are hard targets. And it gets to reroll wounds for the unit inside, which is also great. So because it also buffs so many of the good units in our army, I mean, think about it for a second. Fire Dragons, Striking Scorpions, Death Jester, Solitaire. There's going to be more units that we're going to talk about in just a bit that it's good with. So, it really buffs all of these units that are in S tier. So, of course, it's going to be an S tier itself. It's a very good platform on its own. It's not a tax. It's not a transport tax because it actually does a lot of good damage by itself, too. So, yeah, Falcon, S tier. Viper, A tier. Very good unit, very good support, removes cover from enemy units, and it's only 75 points now for a Bright Lance, which is awesome. If you're going for pure firepower, of course, the Warwalker is a little bit better for that, but the utility offered from the Ignores cover ability, I think, makes it justified. It makes it justifiable to use in almost every list. I think people should run at least one Viper in every single list. Being able to remove cover from anything you want in the game that you can draw a line of sight to is immensely powerful. It is pretty fragile, the Viper, but it's also very small and easy to hide. And it's long enough to where in a pinch you could use it to move block. So, and also, it can tank shock at toughness 6. So that's pretty good as well. I know it also has strength 6 too, so that's not that big of a deal, but being able to do that is pretty strong. So, you can also deal a few extra mortal wounds to it in certain cases. Okay. Next up is the Wave Serpent. Wave Serpent is B tier. And it's only B tier. I mean, it's usable, right? It's a good transport. It's solid. But you need certain units to be able to be good with it. Like, you need units like Yvraine and the Troupe. You need units like Corsairs, which get Scout, to really bring the Wave Serpent into a higher tier. So I think that in certain builds, the Wave Serpent's very good, but in other builds, it's just whatever. And I think that's why it's B tier, essentially, right? Like, for example, let me give you a quick example. It doesn't do much for Wraithguard besides being a transport, right? Which is why I think it's probably more of a B tier. With things like Corsair Void Reavers and Void Scar, it gets the Scout move, which make it more mobile, which then in turn allow it to threaten more units in the early game, allow it to move block better, basically just be a nuisance, tank shock things, which is why I think that with Corsairs, they're really good. I'd say they're an A tier unit. But with other units, they're just not great. Sometimes you'd want to use it with Dire Avengers, but that makes Dire Avengers really expensive. And I've actually kind of been of the opinion now that because of the nerf to indirect fire, if you don't see a lot of indirect fire, it's better to just maybe run Dire Avengers on foot, because if they're not going to get shot by indirect fire, there's not much that you can do once they're in the middle of the battlefield anyway to protect them. So the Wave Serpent isn't going to really do anything from then, except be a nuisance and maybe charge a unit, tank shock, tie something up, but that's... Your Dire Avengers are probably still dead, is my point. So I do like the Wave Serpent. It is a good transport, but is it as good as a Falcon or something like that? No, absolutely not. Okay. Oh, I will say though, its ability now to Battle Shock is really good with the new Pariah Mission Nexus rules. So that is really good. It's only a once per game though, which kind of sucks, but it also does deal D3 mortal wounds too. So it's a little bit of an extra thing that is going for the Wave Serpent. Next up is the support weapon. I will also put that in B tier. Support weapons took a big hit, hitting, well, they used to hit on 3s. Now they hit on 4s. And that's a big deal for a unit that has a single attack. It's huge, right? Or may have a single attack. It has D3 attacks with Blast, which against most targets, you're going to get 2. So only being able to hit one of those on average versus being able to reliably hit 2 of those with the reroll, Eldar reroll, is massive. It takes a huge chunk out of its damage, and I think the D-Cannon in general is pretty much a non-factor in most competitive lists. Now, there are some competitive lists where it might still be good, because, you know, if you're running like 3 of them, for example, it could still be worth it to just say, all right, I'm just going to still take them because that's my playstyle. They work for this list. And, you know, I'm maybe running the Avatar of Khaine, or I'm maybe running something that I really have to protect, and D-Cannons are the only thing that can do it. Well, if that's the case, then I think the D-Cannons are still going to probably be in your list. But I will also say, though, hitting on 4s is not good. So I think 135 points apiece, you know, 3 of those is going to be 295. No, I'm wrong. 395. It's going to be 395 points, which is 400 points of your army into 3 D-Cannons, which can easily be killed. So you have to start thinking about, well, the D-Cannons are fragile. They're more resilient because of, you know, indirect fire nerfs. They're more resilient against indirect fire, but I also need something to protect them. So now you're thinking of things like the Solitaire, or perhaps even Howling Banshees, to try to protect your D-Cannons from fast-moving assault units that you can't screen out. And it just becomes really expensive. It becomes a huge point sink to be able to invest in that strategy. So I think there might be better units to be able to support the Avatar of Khaine than D-Cannons. But again, you know, I haven't really run a list like that in a long time with 3 D-Cannons and the Avatar of Khaine all in one. So I don't know how effective it would be, and I don't know how much the hit would, you know, affect that playstyle. But I think the indirect fire hit does affect them in quite a big way. So I would say they're B tier. They're still definitely usable in some builds that you know, build around them. But again, I just don't think they're going to be in most lists. They're definitely not going to be as popular as things like, you know, a Viper or a Fire Prism. Okay, next up is the Warwalker. The Warwalker is A tier. It's excellent. It is a little bit expensive in this meta because you're not seeing as many vehicles out there, but it's still good. Scout move, 2 Bright Lances, like I said before when I was talking about the Hornet, a 4+ invul, -1 to wound. Those are all good things, right? -1 to wound is great against, you know, low kind of strength attacks. Anything that is like a heavy bolter or, you know, a bolter is going to be basically needing 6s to wound against it, which is awesome. It means you're not going to be dying very often to those types of weapons. However, very powerful weapons still will wound it pretty much on average dice, right? I mean, for example, if you take a look at things like a las cannon. No, sorry. Like anything more than a las cannon, right? If something is like strength 14, which there are things like that in the game, it's going to wound it on 2s or 3s, excuse me, which is still really likely to happen, and you only get a 50% chance of surviving, right? Because it only has 6 wounds. So it is still fragile, don't get me wrong, but it is durable enough to survive against, you know, some light firepower and stuff. And, you know, 110 points is a pretty good price for a platform that can trade well against enemy tanks. So I do like the Warwalker even so. And it's really good against, you know, opponents on terrain dense boards because, again, like I said, it has a small profile. It's very, easy to hide, easy to maneuver and stuff like that, and it is very powerful for what you get. Next up is the Void Weaver, and I think the Void Weaver is B tier. Its damage still sucks, guys. Don't get me wrong. Its damage against tough targets is bad, but it's a little bit better against infantry, and because it has that battle shock mechanic that is good against stopping certain secondaries, I think I would put it from C tier, which I would put it before, into B tier. I think it's a little bit better now, especially with the points decrease that it got. So yeah, I think it's better. Do I think it's amazing? No. And I think it's going to still be great in Harlequin lists because Harlequins are going to take this anyway. Absolutely. But, like I said, once again, probably not the best unit out there. Next up is the Star Weaver, and that's an A tier transport. Very effective at what it does. Allows Harlequins to jump back into the transport afterwards, after they assault and if they're unengaged, which is powerful. Also just allows things like a Death Jester to jump back in if it wants to, right? Like I've had many times where I've just used the Death Jester to hop out of this thing, shoot at something, and then hop right back in. It does kind of make the Death Jester a little bit, susceptible if this thing gets destroyed, but you can place the Death Jester in a way to where it's farther away from where it began. So actually, in some cases, can put it outside of lone op range, even if it's battle shocked, right? So your opponent will not be able to shoot them, even though it is battle shocked and just recently got out of a destroyed transport. So yeah, I definitely think it's still really good. It's tricky, and that's what I love about Eldar and Harlequin units is they're tricky, and this thing has a great ability for that. Also has 2 shuriken cannons. So I mean, for 80 points, something that has a 4+ invul save and 2 shuriken cannons, it's really not that bad. It's a little bit tougher than people expect, which is also good. Okay, Skyweavers. Skyweavers are still A tier. They took a hit with their points, but they're still great at taking out vehicles. Haywire is always going to be that anti-vehicle killer. To me, they're more of a finisher. They can really finish off enemy vehicles that your other units have started. And because they have 24-inch range, mostly if they only have line of sight to that target you're shooting at, they're going to be safe from most other targets. So I do like Skyweavers, and they can also do some decent, screening. They can also do some decent combat if you have the Zephyr Glaives on them. I like the Star Bolas personally more, just because I like to, shoot at Marines or something else besides a vehicle. My favorite thing, and what I usually notice, is my opponents are moving Marine units up with their vehicles to support, and, throwing the Bolas at a Marine squad, killing a couple models there, and then, shooting and finishing off something like a Land Raider, while also screening that Terminator unit or Aggressor unit or whatever's inside of that Land Raider from the other things in your army, slowing them down, is a great way to use them. And yeah, they'll die afterward, of course, but they more than make up for their value. Next up is Harlequin Troops. And again, I think Harlequin Troops, I'm just going to say, guys, I think they're an S tier unit. I think by themselves they're a little bit weak, but when you start attaching characters to them, they become really powerful. Troupe Masters, Yvraine, Visarch, all are very good and make the Harlequins exceptional. And I think that's why they belong in S tier. They're a very powerful unit. They also have the benefit of giving +1 to wound to the units, or to the models that join them. So giving +1 wound to the Visarch, to the Troupe Master, doesn't really matter much for Yvraine, but it kind of actually does, weirdly enough, help Yvraine if you're going against a target that's a vehicle or a monster, because basically normally she'd be wounding on 6s, and with the Troupe, she's wounding on 5s now, which is still good, especially with the AP that her weapon has. So that kind of makes her even kind of, I won't say good into those units, but not useless into those units, if that makes sense. So yeah, very good unit, has grenades, has great movement, and just overall a fantastic unit. And that's why I put it in S tier, because normally I'd put a unit that is like that in A tier if the supporting units are in A tier, like Yvraine, the Visarch, the Troupe Master, they're all A tier. Why are troops in S tier? Well, because the troops actually help the leaders themselves as well. So the leaders help the troops, but the troops also help the leaders also, right? And that's not something you can say about every single unit. Okay, so I really like troops. And of course, if you make them battle line, they're even better. So that's kind of one other reason why they're in S tier. Rangers are next, and Rangers are an A tier unit. They're great screening, right? They're the cheapest unit that can screen in our entire index, which is awesome. So they are good at that. I'm a Ranger enjoyer personally. I do like them a lot. My thing about Rangers, of course, is that, their recent ability did get nerfed. If you disembark from a transport within their range, they cannot use their outcast ability, but they can still use their outcast ability if the transport ends within 9. So that is pretty good. So they're a good screening unit. They can do some decent damage against light characters if given the chance. And in general, I think Rangers are a pretty good early game unit for denying infiltrators and also for screening. Again, though, Scorpions are probably a little bit better for this overall now because Scorpions also have the damage. They also have, a lot of other stuff. But if you're only using a unit to basically deny enemy infiltrators and also to sacrifice itself, then the Rangers are the better play by about, 10 points. Okay. Shroud Runners are next. Shroud Runners are honestly S tier. And I'm going to go forward and just say they're S tier because they work perfectly with other S tier units. They're also a great screening unit. They have great durability for the cost, which you wouldn't think from an Eldar unit, but they actually do with 3 wounds, toughness 4, and -1 to hit natively. And also, guess what, guys? 5-up invul save, just because, right? Because they're an outcast unit. So they're really very effective at doing a bunch of different stuff. They have great firepower. They have Ranger long rifles and scatter lasers, which are good against light infantry and characters a little bit as well. Maybe you can get lucky with them. I've certainly gotten lucky before killing, Imperial Guard officers with a couple of Shroud Runners. And lastly, they have the ability to mark a target with lethal hits. So your whole army can get lethal hits against their marked target. Shroud Runners are definitely an S tier. You see them in a lot of competitive lists, and I think they're definitely a unit that warrants taking in most competitive builds, especially if you're using Wind Riders. But even if you're not using Wind Riders, they can still be good because they are fast, they have scout, and they're good at screening, and they're kind of tough, right? And they can kind of duel with a lot of early game units, and what I mean by early game units is units that are going to be moving up the board in the early stages to secure objectives and stuff. They're actually pretty good at dealing damage to them, which is, you would think is kind of strange, but they actually are not bad at it. I've had situations where I've had a unit of 3 Shroud Runners shoot and kill 3 enemy infiltrators, which I honestly shouldn't happen because mathematically it doesn't make sense for them to do that. But, there's been situations where my opponent just rolls a little bit less than average, and that ends up, killing more models than it should. So Shroud Runners are definitely good in multiple different ways, and I think that's what makes them an S tier unit. Next up is Warlock Conclaves on foot. And they're a C tier unit. I think I think they really do need a detachment bonus. Like, if they got the Thousand Suns detachment bonus, which gives devastating wounds to psychic weapons and attacks, they'd be great. They'd be an A tier unit. But unfortunately, they're just too expensive for the damage they do at the moment. So for now, they're going to be in C tier. They do give bonuses to Farseers, but you don't want a Farseer in them because they're not that durable anyway, and they're too expensive for what they do, right? So you don't want them just sitting in the backfield because they'll probably still die. They just won't contribute a lot to the battle. I mean, they're 30 points apiece. So just think about it for a second. What else is 30 points? Well, there's a lot of Terminator equivalent opponents out there that are 30 points a model. And you have to ask yourself, is a Warlock with 2 wounds, toughness 3, and a 4+ invul save a Terminator equivalent? And it has a heavy flamer, but it's a little bit worse? Absolutely not. These guys are not worth the points. Now, there is an argument in fun lists and fluffy lists that you'd be able to, run them in a Falcon with rerolls to wound and, stuff like that with a Farseer in there, and they could do a lot of damage out of a Falcon. Yeah, for sure they can. But for 200 points, and the whole package together is 340 for all that. So I just don't think they're really worth that cost. That's all. So, think about it. You can get double Scorpions for the same cost, basically, as one unit of 4 of these guys. So, yeah, they're just not that good. Same thing with the Warlock Conclave, on Jetbike. Skyrunner Conclave. I actually think the Skyrunner Conclave is worse than the Foot Conclave because it's more expensive. It's 50 points a model, which is absolutely insane. It's like the guy writing this. It's almost like a different guy wrote the rules for the Eldar Codex. Like the Eldar Codex was basically, when it came out, was written by 2 different people. One person wrote, all the units in these lower tiers, like, Well, not some of them, obviously, because they were better, but, like Shining Spears, the Warlock Conclaves, like, I feel like somebody got those and just made them way overpriced. And then somebody else got things like Swooping Hawks and, like, Wraith Knights and stuff like that in the beginning of the edition. I think there was definitely two people that were working on it separately. So, yeah, these guys suck as well. They don't do anything for the Farseer Skyrunner. The Farseer Skyrunner is much better with Wind Riders, which is our next unit. So our next unit is Wind Riders, and they're S tier. They're great in the meta. They do a ton of damage to enemy Marines, but they have enough firepower to actually damage heavier vehicles as well, especially in combination with Shroud Runners. Oh my god, the lethal hits on these guys makes Wind Riders amazing against pretty much anything in the game. They have auto rerolls if the unit is the closest and also on an objective, which is nice. But in most cases, you're going to pair them with a Farseer Skyrunner so they can automatically get guide and be able to reroll anything anyway. So that's a very powerful combo. And yeah, Shroud Runners, obviously one of the best units in the entire book at the moment for the current meta. Wraithblades. Wraithblades are a B tier unit. Now, the only reason I put them in B tier, they are very durable against shooting. If an enemy wants to shoot them, if they're in cover, they're pretty durable against those types of attacks. Really, the only thing that is their main weakness is melee, which seems weird because they are a melee unit. But they only get a 4+ invul save, so a lot of units out there have damage 3 weapons that are really good in melee, especially some of the more elite units that you'll see, and they can rip right through Wraithguard in one charge phase. The other problem I have with Wraithguard is even though they have fight on death, I should say, they kind of just sit there and they don't really do much besides just sit on an objective. I realize that you need a unit like that in your army at some point, but it's a lot of points to invest in a unit that just sits there and does nothing except, sit there. And it just doesn't seem like a big strength of the Eldar in general. So let me give you a quick example. I played the Wraith Brick in quite a few games, and although it did score primary victory points for me most of the time, it didn't do much else. And I felt like I could have gotten away with not having that if I needed to. Like, I could have scored the same amount of primary victory points with more destructive units that could destroy the enemy units in the area and then, kind of have a lone op on the objective. I would have scored the same amount of primary victory points as a big unit of Wraithblades. I think the main problem with Blades, is they're just expensive, right? They're $340 for 10, which is already pretty high in cost. It means you're 34 points a model. And then on top of that, and again, just want to go back real quick to the Warlock on foot Conclave is 30 points a model. These guys are 34 points a model, and they're way better. Think about it. Anyway, I digress. So the 34 points a model, you have to add the Spirit Seer to them. That puts them up to 395, which is really expensive. And then on top of that, you need a Farseer to fortune them. So that's almost 500 points worth of units that you're using just to hold one objective on the battlefield. That's really not that great, especially with secret missions now. I think Wraithguard, or Wraithblades, I should say, a lot of people might look at, Unbroken Wall and say, well, now I have something for my Wraith army to be good at. But the problem with that is that your opponent can definitely chip away at these guys over the course of the game, and if they have something really powerful, they might just wipe them out in one blow, right? And that's only one objective that they can hold. You still have to worry about the other two objectives. So, I'd rather personally spend 500 points on things that can kill my opponent's units quicker so that I can dominate the battlefield and I don't need to worry about my opponent being able to kill me or not, right? So that's kind of where I'm at with Wraithblades. I think they can be really good in certain lists, but because of the price rise in so many of the other units in our army, I just think that maybe we want to invest a little bit more in damage and play more towards that, especially with some of the other secret missions that exist in Pariah Nexus. However, again, there are some situations in some primary missions which Wraithblades can be good at. So I don't think they're a bad unit. I think they're pretty decent, but I just think they're probably more B tier because they have a lot of counters, they have a lot of problems, and for me personally, they just sit on an objective and do nothing else. So that's not really my play style. So I don't really like them that much because of that. But they're still a pretty durable unit and pretty decent. Wraithguard, I think, are in the same camp. They're less durable. but they do have the shooting attack. So in my opinion, I prefer Wraithguard a little bit more, but they are also more expensive, right? They are 190 and basically 20 points more per 5. So that is quite a bit more expensive, especially when you join them with a Spirit Seer. Now with the Spirit Seer, you kind of lose on, because they have lethal hits, they kind of lose on the devastating wounds a little bit, which does suck. But you do need the Spirit Seer for +1 to hit. So it's a little bit of a, contradiction there. So it is, again, another expensive unit that basically just wants to sit on an objective. The benefit is it does get to shoot at enemy units coming in. It gets to shoot back at the enemy that targeted it, which is nice because of its ability. And, basically it's a unit that is going to do essentially the same thing, just slightly differently. Wraith Lords, I think, are A tier now. And some people may argue that, but, I think they're just cheap enough now to where they're within a budget range to where they can hold a side objective on the weak side of the battlefield for a very good cost. You can give it Bright Lances. It has Flamers. It's powerful against infantry in combat. It does hit on 4s, but, Sisters of Battle are looking good. Anything with 1 wound, the sweep attack is actually really good. So toughness 3, 1 wound, the sweeps are going to be just fine. Against tougher targets, the strikes are going to be a little bit hit or miss. But even so, the reason you take a Wraith Lord really isn't because of damage. It's because they can bully the midboard a little bit against units that can't really damage them. So are they good against other units that are meant to kill monsters and vehicles? No, they're not. Dedicated anti-monster, anti-vehicle units that are around the same points will easily kill a Wraith Lord. But the Wraith Lord's job is to bully lesser units that don't have a good chance of killing them. All your early game units, and what I mean by that is, units that your opponent kind of maneuvers into position in the early game, things like legionaries, things like intercessors, your Space Marine units, all those kind of things, Wraith Lords are very good at. One of my buddies, he runs a lot of tactical Space Marines, right? So he has a lot of tactical Space Marine squads, and Wraith Lords do so well against those, it's not even funny, right? One Wraith Lord will engage a unit of 10 in combat, and will, kind of, kill a couple of them, kill like 2 or 3 of them, and my opponent can't do anything against it, right? His attacks are wounding on 6s. And that's basically how it stays. If my opponent wants to fall back, he can definitely spend the resources on that, but even if he wants to shoot the Wraith Lord, he's wounding on 6s. And the only, he has a plasma gun in there, of course, he has a last cannon in there, but they're not that effective. Even so, the last cannon is the most effective thing against it, and oftentimes it just either, well, in my experience, it either misses or it doesn't wound. Last cannons. But, it's going to be very effective against those types of units. So it can really bully those units and either, keep them in combat, of course, or prevent them from really doing what they want to do. So I like Wraith Lords a lot. And also a pretty good intervention, heroic intervention unit now, because it's only 1 CP. Yes, he doesn't have fights first, but it's going to lock whatever unit's going to kill your unit in combat, so at least that enemy unit's going to be, for sure dead and not going to be able to do anything else. The Wraith Seer is going to be B tier, and that's simply because the Wraith Seer is just not as good as it used to be. It's 160. I think the Battle Shock ability is decent, but, it wasn't that great of a choice before. I think in most cases people would have taken the Wraith Lord before. There was only certain fringe cases where you'd want a Wraith Seer, and now that it's more expensive, it's just going to be worse altogether. So yeah, Wraith Seer, unfortunately, not that great. B tier. Wraith Knight, B tier. Again, Wraith Knight is good. Wraith Knight, I think, is better than it was previously, just because of the fact that, the meta is changing a little bit, and more people are focused on anti-marine equivalent than they are, killing big targets. Having said that, it's towering, it's titanic, it cannot hide, and it will go down if your opponent has the firepower to kill it. So, even with Fortune, its damage just doesn't do enough anymore against those types of enemies. So yeah, in general, I just think that's kind of where the Wraith Knight stands with that in mind. The Skathach Wraithknight, on the other hand, I think is an A tier unit. Now, what makes it A tier versus the normal Wraithknight is that it's mobile. It has a once per game sky leap, and it has better weapons. It has Inferno Lances, which are 24-inch, 4-shot apiece, Melta weapons. They're insane. They're basically strength 12, so they're fire pike strength, AP -4, and they deal D6 damage, and they have Melta too. So they're pretty insane. Again, 4 shots apiece, and you can take 2 of them. They're excellent. They're absolutely excellent. Now, the Death Shroud cannons, I would say, were normally, my favorite before this, but because Overwatch got nerfed to where Titanic units can't Overwatch anymore, I really don't think it's great anyway on them. So you're better off just going with the Inferno cannons. It does a ton of damage against basically anything within 12. Because it has a 24-inch range, half range for Melta, you can definitely use this on units within half range to get that Melta bonus on Deep Strike. So, really powerful model, and it's cheaper than the Wraithknight. Webway Gate. Sadly, GW just doesn't give any attention to fortifications. I don't even know why they're in the game. They should just be terrain pieces. I have no idea why GW actually has rules for these anymore. But who knows? Maybe in the future it'll actually be good. The Cobra is a super heavy. Now we're getting into super heavies and stuff, so it's going to be a little bit different. It's not really super comparable to other units in the Codex, or Index, I should say, but I'm going to actually put this in B tier. I actually think it's pretty good. It has a pretty good range. If it can draw line of sight to targets, it can do some serious damage with its, big D impaler. I mean, just look at that big D. I mean, that's huge, right? Jeez. Anyway, it's a massive, massive damaging weapon. And it's not bad with the new pivot rules. I think it's, this thing is a little bit better. Even if you have to pay 2 inches to pivot, like, even if they nerf it and you have to pay 2 inches like everybody else, it's awesome, right? It's a huge tank. It's on a circular base, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And, again, like I said, even if it's not and you have to pay the 2 inches, I still think it's really good for what it is. And Fire and Fade still cost 2 command points on it. So yeah, it's really expensive. But in certain situations, it might actually be better to use this on certain, wider boards than 3 Fire Prisms, right? And I think it does a lot of damage. Its De-Rift ability is kind of a short range, right? It only does additional, mortal wounds to units within 6, I believe. But on some of the new deployments, especially on a deployment that, is a diagonal deployment that, has your opponent packed into one corner of the battlefield, if you can draw a line of sight to something and your opponent makes a mistake, you can actually do some serious damage to the surrounding units. So I actually think in certain cases this could be a really good pick. I know that seems really weird and out there, but I think it's actually pretty decent. The Nightwing is awful. It's just a worse Crimson Hunter in every single way, and it's almost the same points. It's garbage. I will never take this thing. It looks really cool, really awesome model, but I think if you have this model, just say it's a Crimson Hunter, guys. Just proxy it, because it just, the rules are so bad for it. I think it gets +1 to hit against flyers as well, so its ability's worse, its weapons are worse. Oh, it's just awful. Okay, the Revenant Titan is next. Or is this the Phantom? No, this is the Revenant. Okay, so this is the Revenant Titan. And the Revenant Titan, I think, is probably C tier, just because it's so expensive. I mean, it's like 1,100 points, or 1,100 points, right? So it's really expensive. I don't think its damage is to the level that it needs to be, but I think it's a fun pick. I think that you can definitely use units to buff it. Like, you could use Guide on it, make it really powerful. You could use Fortune on it, make it really durable. So there's things you can do to make it survive longer and stuff like that. But again, it suffers from being really big. It's a really big model, and it's Titanic, so everybody can see it. It does have some cool abilities. I think it has the ability to basically, if I'm not mistaken, advance quicker up the battlefield. So that's cool. So it's very quick. But yeah, I don't know about it. I don't know about it. It's definitely something people could use in regular games, but it's a large chunk of your points, and it'll probably die within the first 3 turns of the game. So to me, it's just probably not worth taking in most competitive lists, but it's really fun, and it can be good if given the proper support. Next up is the Scorpion, and I think the Scorpion's B tier as well. I think it's pretty awesome. In a meta that involves a lot of transports, it's actually really cool as well because it makes transports and, you know, just basically vehicles in general, anything with Deadly Demise, if it shoots it and kills it, Deadly Demise goes off on a 4+, which is really good for dealing extra mortal wounds to things surrounding it, right? So that's really cool. I like that. It's also very powerful. It has the same benefits of, you know, being on that round base, being able to pivot for free, or, you know, if it gets nerfed for 2 inches. So that's really cool as well. I'm a real big fan of the Scorpion and the Cobra in Pariah Nexus. Now, of course, there are going to be deployments, just like for the Fire Prism, that the terrain setup is not going to be favorable. So that's probably why it's a B tier unit. It's a little bit less favorable in those circumstances. So they can definitely work, especially again with things like Guide and, you know, Fortune to like really buff them up, or Fire and Fade. But, you know, you do have to pour a lot of resources into them. So that is something you have to think about. Okay, last and definitely not least, the biggest in the entire, you know, index is the Phantom Titan. Dun dun dun. The Phantom Titan. I'm going to put it in C tier just because, but I'm going to tell you guys one thing right now. It can't be played in a normal game. So it's 3,500 points. It's only an APOC unit. You can't play it in a regular game of 40k. It's awesome for what it is. I think among the Titans, it's one of the better ones, especially with buffs like Fortune and Guide and stuff like that. It could really be good. But again, you know, it can't be played in normal games, so I can't really justify putting it in any category because it can't be played. But I have to say, it is pretty good, I think, for APOC games, you know? Like, if you're playing a 10,000 point game and you bring 3 of these bad boys, I think it could be pretty cool, right? Or, no, you'd have to bring that in an 11,000 point game. But, you know, even, you know, bringing, imagine this, 2 of these guys and, like, maybe, like, 2 Revenant Titans would be, like, really cool. So, there's a lot of cool things you could do in APOC with these guys. I've never owned one of these. They're massive, but, you know, at the same time, it would be pretty fun to run in an APOC game and stuff like that. So I'll put it in C tier just out of respect. I think in an APOC game, it could be really good. And that's a whole nother tier list that I can't even really do because I don't really play a lot of APOC, so I don't know. All right, so that's the tier list, guys. That's where I think the units should be. I know some of the units are in the same kind of positions they were before, but some units have changed, right? There's a lot of units up here, for example, that have changed for me, like the Troupe. The Troupe is definitely S tier now, in my opinion. Wind Riders are definitely S tier, and that is slightly different, I think, than it was before. I also have units like the Solitaire in S tier, right? So there is some changes here. There's definitely a lot of changes in A tier for sure. I know that I don't think I put the Wraith Lord in A tier before. I think I put in B tier. You know, we have the Skathach Wraithknight in A tier as well. So there's a lot of units, again, that have jumped up to A tier. And as for B tier, there's some units that have jumped down to B tier. I think the Autarch on foot probably went down to B tier, if I'm not mistaken, based on my last review. Dark Reapers went down, right? So there's a lot of units that did also take a hit from A tier previously to B tier. So there's a lot of changes here. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and kind of can get some ideas about what's good and what's not. But that doesn't mean that this is definitive. Once again, these are my opinions. But let me know in the comment section what you guys think about each unit and why or why not, you know, they might belong in the tier that they're in. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year and a half. Almost 2 years now, if you can believe that, which is awesome. And a little bit of a history about this channel. I actually started this channel during the pandemic, and my goal was, you know, to help Eldar players feel better about their army. Because at the time, if you guys remember, you know, during 7th edition, we had this index, or during 8th edition, I believe, we had this just awful index before we got our codex. It was just so bad. And I wanted to try to, you know, kind of reach out to Eldar players and say, hey, like, actually, there's some really cool tricks you can do with Swooping Hawks, and there's, you know, you could do this and you could do that. And then our codex came out, and it was just like, I was originally going to kind of do more of, you know, talking about how to proxy stuff in games and stuff like that. But, you know, anyway, again, I'm going off topic, but, you know, this channel has really come a long way. And I think, a couple of months into my channel, it was doing very well. And believe it or not, I got hacked at one point and all my content got deleted at one point in the creation of the channel as well. And I had to restart from scratch. And the one thing I will remember, and I'll always remember this in the community, is I came out and I said, hey guys, all my content got deleted. I'm a little sad. I was almost to 1,000 subscribers. And I'm going to keep going though. I'm going to keep doing videos. I'm going to keep doing this, but it's going to take a while for me to recover and get all the videos back on YouTube. So hang in there with me, and if you know anybody, to resubscribe, definitely do that to help and everything like that. And I couldn't believe it, but guess who kind of hops on and says, hey, why don't you give this guy a shot? Why don't you give this channel a shot and subscribe? Was Auspex Tactics, which I had no idea. I didn't even think that was going to happen, but he gave me a shout out when I was struggling, and I really appreciated that a lot. So, and by the way, if you guys haven't already, subscribe to his channel. I really like most of his content in general. So, definitely check him out. I always watch his videos with new releases and stuff like that. Anytime he's talking about what the community thinks about the Eldar, I'm always watching those videos. So, anyway. Not really an endorsement or anything like that, but definitely a cool channel. And the history of the channel has in part him to thank for helping it recover after that time period, as well as the community in general who are already subscribed and who resubscribed and spread the word. So again, thank you so much. I think this community is great community we have here, and I'm going to try to keep making better content for you guys. And the other thing I want to mention real quick before we kind of end the video is I am aware that some of the videos I have do have kind of, in some ways clickbaity titles. And I understand that I've been a little bit hesitant to go away from that. I personally find that fun to do. I just think it's funny. I'm a bit of a troll in a way, in a lot of ways. So doing a title like that brings me, a few laughs. It brings me a little bit of joy doing it. That's really why I do it. It's not because, I want to misrepresent the Eldar, or I want to misrepresent the community or anything like that. I understand that sometimes when people read a title, they take it very literally. So if I say the Eldar are going to, be totally busted in Pariah Nexus and they're going to be so OP, that may be a little bit of an exaggeration, and some people may watch the video thinking, oh my God, these guys are going to be super OP, and then they, watch the video and then they're like, well, they're going to be strong in Pariah Nexus, but I don't think they're going to be the dominant army. I don't think they're going to be number one, right? So when I do the titles to my videos, just let you guys know, it's more of, that's what I find fun to do, and that's what I find to be, interesting and stuff, and that's just my personal take on it. If you guys, however, as a community don't like that, let me know, but I will say this. Those kind of titles, believe it or not, actually do help get other people that are maybe playing other armies to be more interested in the Eldar. And it's just facts, guys. It's just numbers. Like there have been more people that have, watched the videos, liked the videos, interacted with the videos because of the more interesting titles. I won't call them pure clickbait because I think some of them are actually true. I wholeheartedly believe that the Eldar are going to be good in Pariah Nexus, so that's, absolutely true. And I think, maybe some videos are over the top, but I will promise you guys this. I'm never going to have an offensive video title. I'm never going to have something that's, super offensive or anything like that. So don't worry about that. But that's my explanation as to why sometimes you see the title of videos and they're exaggerative. They're a little bit exaggerated. That's all. So anyway, guys, wanted to mention that, but also wanted to mention that if you do want to support the channel and join the Discord, I will leave the link in the description for that, and that will give you permanent access to our Discord community. So it's via Patreon, by the way. If you join up on a free trial with Patreon, I give you a free, basically, link to our Discord, and you can join and you get permanent access forever. And it's totally free. You can join a Patreon free trial. Of course, if you do decide to donate via Patreon, that would be awesome, and I really appreciate it, but you don't have to. I really just want to build up the community and build up the Discord. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page as well. So if you want to support the channel via those means and get some, Eldar inspired apparel on the channel store page, or you want to, kind of grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave the links in the description for those as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.